What if I told you that the book of Deuteronomy holds one of the most shocking political conspiracies in ancient history? Most people think they know this biblical book. Just laws and farewell speeches. Right? Wrong. Hidden beneath the surface is a narrative so complex, so controversial, that scholars have debated it for centuries. We're talking disputed authorship, mysterious deaths, a legal code that reshaped an entire civilization. You're about to discover why Deuteronomy might be the most misunderstood book in the entire Bible, and why its true story reads more like a political thriller than a religious text. But before we get into it, if you're new here, take a moment to hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. I'd love to hear from you. Introduce yourself. Let us know where you're watching from, what time it is there. It really makes us feel like the global community we are. Thank you for joining me today. So without further delay, let's dive in. The Lost Book and the Doomed King. A prologue in Crises. The year is 622 BCE. Jerusalem stands at the edge of chaos. Young King Josiah is barely into his 20s. He's ordered repairs on the temple. The building has fallen into decay. Generations of kings before him worshipped other gods. The house of the Lord became just another shrine among many. Sacred spaces once devoted to a single deity now accommodate multiple altars. Multiple rituals. Multiple loyalties. During the renovation, the high priest Hilkiah makes a discovery. Hidden beneath rubble and forgotten corners, he finds a scroll. Not just any scroll. The Book of the Law. When the scroll is brought before the king and read aloud, something extraordinary happens. Josiah tears his royal robes. The gesture signals more than grief. It reveals terror. The words on that ancient scroll describe a covenant. Terms were set. Promises were made. Curses were pronounced for breaking the agreement. As Josiah listens, he realizes something devastating. His kingdom has violated nearly every requirement. The nation has wandered so far from its founding document that the king himself didn't know what it contained. Think about that for a moment. The ruler of Judah discovers the legal foundation of his own kingdom as if encountering a foreign text. The scroll speaks of exclusive worship, one God, one altar, one loyalty. But Josiah's kingdom has scattered its devotion across hilltops and valleys, mixing the worship of the Lord with rituals borrowed from neighboring peoples. The book describes blessings for obedience, long life in the land, prosperity, security, peace. Then it describes curses for disobedience, drought, defeat, exile. The language is stark. The consequences are cosmic. Obey and flourish. Disobey and perish. Josiah sends messengers to the prophetess Huldah. She lives in Jerusalem's second quarter. When she hears about the scroll, her response confirms the king's worst fears. The curses are real. Judgment is coming. The treaty has been broken, and the consequences are already in motion. But there's a window, a brief chance. Huldah tells the messengers that because Josiah's heart is responsive, because he humbles himself, disaster won't come during his lifetime. The king has space to act, room to reform, time to turn the nation back toward its founding principles. Josiah launches a revolution. He tears down altars across the land. He destroys the high places where people worshipped multiple gods. The Asherah poles are cut down. The shrines to Baal are demolished. He breaks the carved images and grinds them to powder. He even desecrates the sites themselves, making them unusable for future worship. The reform spreads beyond Judah. Josiah pushes north into the former territory of the northern kingdom, destroyed by Assyria a century earlier. At Bethel, where Jeroboam once established an alternative worship site, Josiah tears down the altar. He burns the bones of the old priests on their own altars. fulfilling a prophecy spoken 3 centuries before. Then he does something unprecedented. He celebrates Passover, but not just any Passover. The text says no Passover like this had been observed since the days of the judges. Not under Samuel, not under David, not under Solomon. The nation rediscovers its founding story by reenacting the night their ancestors were spared in Egypt. Josiah centralizes worship in Jerusalem. The priests from the outlying areas are brought to the capital. The temple becomes the only legitimate place of sacrifice. This isn't just religious reform. It's political consolidation. The scattered tribal loyalties are focused on a single point: one God, one place, one people, all because of one scroll. Scholars today call this the Deuteronomic reform. The book Hilkiah found was almost certainly Deuteronomy, or a core portion of it. Archaeological evidence supports the timing. The reforms align precisely with the book's commands. The theological emphasis matches. The political program fits. But here's what makes this moment so profound. The book didn't create new laws. It reminded the nation of old ones. Laws given centuries earlier. Laws the people had forgotten so completely that their rediscovery felt like revolution. Consider the situation. A nation loses touch with its founding document. Generations pass. New practices emerge. Foreign influences creep in. The old ways fade into memory, then fade from memory. The scroll sits in a corner of the temple, unread and unremembered. Then crisis forces renovation, and renovation uncovers what was lost. Josiah's reforms couldn't save the kingdom. Within 2 decades, the king would meet his end at Megiddo. Trying to stop the Egyptian army from marching north, his sons would prove weak. The Babylonian Empire would rise. Within 23 years of Josiah's passing, Babylon would destroy Jerusalem. The temple would burn. The walls would crumble. The people would march into exile, just as the scroll had warned. But the book survived. The scroll that caused a king to tear his clothes would outlast the throne itself. Carried into exile, copied by scribes, studied by scholars, debated by sages, it would become the foundation of a faith that no longer depended on land or temple or king. This is where our story begins, not with the giving of the law, but with its rediscovery, not with Moses on a mountain, but with Josiah in a ruined temple. Because Deuteronomy enters history twice, once in the wilderness, once in a moment of national crisis. The book you're about to encounter isn't just ancient law. It's a time capsule, a founding document, a treaty between a people and their God. More than that, it's a warning embedded in the national charter, a prophecy of failure written into the Constitution itself. Some scholars argue the book was actually written during Josiah's time, created to justify his reforms. Others insist it's genuinely ancient, preserved through oral tradition and written records. The debate continues. But either way, the book functions as an origin story, a people defining themselves by returning to first principles. Josiah found it too late to prevent disaster, but early enough to remember what his people were supposed to be. The scroll he discovered had been waiting in darkness for generations. Now we'll go back further, back to where those words were first spoken, back to the plains east of the Jordan, back to an old man giving his final speech to a generation that never knew slavery, back to the moment when law became sermon, when rules became relationship, when a leader facing his end poured everything he knew into one last desperate appeal. Back to Moses, a farewell in the wilderness. The narrative frame. Picture the plains of Moab, flat, dusty, stretching toward the Jordan River. Across the water lies Canaan, the land promised to Abraham, the destination of a 40-year journey. The end of wandering. Moses stands before the people. He is 120 years old. The text says his eyes are still clear. His strength hasn't faded. But he will not cross the river. God told him Mount Nebo will be his final view. The promised land will be something he sees, but never touches. The man who led the people out of Egypt will die before entering Canaan. The liberator won't share in the liberation's fulfillment. So Moses speaks one last time. This isn't a legal code recited by a bureaucrat. This isn't a priest reading from a scroll. This is a farewell sermon from a man who knows he's running out of time. Every word carries weight. Every command comes wrapped in memory. Every warning emerges from hard-won experience. The people standing before him never experienced Egypt. They were born in the wilderness. Their parents witnessed the plagues. Their parents crossed the Red Sea. Their parents received the law at Sinai. But that generation died in the desert. Rebellion at Kadesh Barnea. 40 years of consequence. The old generation passed away, leaving their children to inherit promises they never personally received. Moses is the bridge, the last living connection to Egypt, the only leader this people has ever known. And he's saying goodbye. The book of Deuteronomy opens with a date and a location. The first day of the 11th month, the 40th year, the plains of Moab, east of the Jordan, across from Jericho. The precision matters. This isn't mythic time. This is a specific moment, a real place, an actual farewell. Moses begins by recounting the journey. Mount Horeb to Kadesh Barnea, the spies sent into the land, the people's fear and refusal to enter, God's anger, the sentence of 40 years, the battles along the way, the victories and defeats. But notice what he's doing. He's not just listing facts. He's interpreting them, shaping them, turning history into lesson. Each event becomes a cautionary tale or an encouraging example. The past is prologue. Memory becomes instruction. This is Deuteronomy's unique voice. Other books in the Torah present law in third person. God spoke to Moses. Moses told the people. Commands are given. Rules are listed. The narrative voice remains external. Deuteronomy shifts to first person. Moses speaks directly. Hear, O people, listen to me. Remember what I tell you. The law doesn't descend from a distant mountain. It flows from the mouth of a dying leader who loves his people enough to be brutally honest about what's coming. And what's coming is both gift and test. The land across the river isn't empty. It's occupied. Fortified cities, established peoples, military powers. The people will have to fight. They will face temptation. They will encounter foreign gods and foreign practices. They will be tested in ways the wilderness never tested them. Moses knows this. He's seen how quickly the people forget. The golden calf, the complaints about food and water, the rebellion against his leadership, the attractions of Moabite worship. He's watched this people for 40 years. He knows their weaknesses, their tendencies, their capacity for both faithfulness and failure. So his speech takes on urgency, not the urgency of a commander issuing orders, but the urgency of a father who won't be there to guide his children through what's ahead. He can't protect them anymore. He can only prepare them. The structure of Deuteronomy reflects this. 3 major speeches, each building on the last, each adding layers of instruction and warning. Between the speeches, Moses writes down the law. He commands it to be read publicly every 7 years. He orders it to be placed beside the Ark of the Covenant. He wants the words to outlast him, because Moses understands something crucial. He's leaving. Joshua will lead the military conquest. Priests will handle the sacrifices. Judges will settle disputes. But who will speak to the people's hearts? Who will remind them why they're doing any of this? Who will keep the story alive? The book will. The scroll will. The words Moses speaks today will echo through generations. Read at assemblies, taught to children, memorized by scholars. The living voice will become written text, and the written text will become living voice again each time someone reads it aloud. This is why Deuteronomy feels different from Exodus or Leviticus or Numbers. Those books document. Deuteronomy persuades. Those books record events as they happen. Deuteronomy looks back and looks forward simultaneously. Memory and prophecy, past and future, bound together in one desperate present moment. Moses stands at a threshold. Behind him lies 40 years of wilderness. Before him lies a land he'll never enter. The people are poised between slavery and inheritance, between wandering and settling, between the generation that knew bondage and the generation that will know freedom. Everything depends on what happens next. Yet, will they remember? Will they obey? Will they hold fast to the covenant? Or will they forget, drift, and lose themselves in the very land meant to be their home? Moses can't answer these questions. He can only ask them, frame them, make them as vivid and urgent as possible. He can paint pictures of blessing and curse, describe the consequences of choice, appeal to memory and hope and fear and love. The land is good, flowing with milk and honey, rich soil, adequate rain, resources for building and growing. But the land is also dangerous. It will make them comfortable. Prosperity will breed forgetfulness. Success will lead to pride. They'll start thinking they earned their blessings through their own strength. Moses says it all: the victory, the settlement, the abundance, and then the slow drift, the adoption of local practices, the worship of local gods, the breakdown of social justice, the exploitation of the weak, the corruption of leaders, the collapse of the covenant. He sees it because he knows his people, and he loves them anyway. This is the emotional core of Deuteronomy. A man who could have walked away, who has every reason to be bitter about his own exclusion from the land, who spent 40 years dealing with complaint and rebellion, yet he spends his final days trying to set his people up for success. The book is a gift from a leader who won't benefit from its teachings to a people who will need it long after he's gone. Moses gathers them on the plains of Moab. The Jordan flows nearby. Canaan waits across the water. And an old man begins to speak, teaching, warning, pleading, hoping, knowing his words are all he has left to give. Deuteronomy is Moses' last will and testament, his legacy, his final act of love. And it begins with 3 simple words that frame everything to follow. These are the words, the central thesis, the Shema and the politics of love. Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. Hear, O people, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. 6 words in Hebrew. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. 6 words that would become the most recited prayer in Jewish history. 6 words that would define a people. 6 words that contain a revolution. The statement sounds simple, almost plain. But in the ancient Near East, this declaration was radical. Every nation around them worshipped multiple gods. Egypt had Ra and Osiris and Isis and dozens more. Mesopotamia had Marduk and Ishtar and Enlil. Canaan had Baal and Asherah and El. The divine realm was crowded, complex, territorial. Different gods controlled different domains. One for the sea, one for the storm, one for fertility, one for war. Life required negotiating with multiple powers, keeping multiple deities satisfied, managing relationships across a pantheon. Political power reflected this. Kings ruled through alliance and treaty. Loyalty was divided. Cities maintained their local gods while acknowledging the supremacy of empire gods. Religious life mirrored political fragmentation. Then Moses speaks 6 words that shatter this entire framework. The Lord is one, not one among many, not the chief God who tolerates lesser gods, not a tribal deity with limited jurisdiction. One, singular, unique, alone. The next verse intensifies the claim. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. Love, not just obedience, not mere ritual compliance. Love. This language comes from the world of treaties and politics. Ancient Near Eastern texts use love to describe the loyalty a vassal owes his king. To love a sovereign means to give exclusive allegiance. No divided loyalties. No secret treaties with rival powers. Complete devotion. Moses takes this political language and applies it to the divine-human relationship. The covenant isn't just law. It's passionate, exclusive, total commitment. The kind of loyalty that admits no competitors. All your heart. The center of will and decision. All your soul. The essence of life itself. All your strength. Every resource and capacity. Nothing held back. Nothing divided. Nothing reserved for other powers. This is why the Shema functions as a political manifesto. In a world of fragmented loyalties, it demands unity. In a culture of negotiated allegiances, it requires totality. In a system built on balancing multiple powers, it insists on singularity. The implications ripple outward. If the Lord is one, and if loyalty must be undivided, then worship must be centralized. No more altars on every hilltop. No more local shrines with their own practices. One God requires one place, one system, one unified expression. If the Lord is one, and if love must be total, then foreign alliances become suspect. Treaties with Egypt or Assyria or Babylon mean invoking their gods as witnesses. Shared meals with foreign leaders mean sharing in their sacrifices. Political relationships carry religious implications. If the Lord is one, and if devotion must be complete, then the people themselves must be unified. Tribal divisions must give way to national identity. Regional loyalties must submit to central authority. The fragmented confederation must become a singular people. The Shema isn't just theology. It's state-building, nation-forming, identity-creating. Moses continues, these words must be impressed on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you rise up. Bind them on your hands. Place them on your foreheads. Write them on your door frames. This isn't casual instruction. This is total immersion. The words must saturate daily life. Morning, evening, work, rest, home, travel, every moment becomes an opportunity for transmission. Every space becomes sacred text. The command creates a culture of memory, a society built on constant recitation, a people whose identity is maintained through words repeated, taught, embodied, because Moses knows what's coming. The land will provide abundance. They'll build houses they didn't construct, eat from vineyards they didn't plant, drink from cisterns they didn't dig. Prosperity will arrive as gift, but will be experienced as achievement. And achievement breeds forgetfulness. Comfort creates amnesia. Success whispers that you did this yourself, that your strength brought these blessings, that you don't really need the Lord who brought you here. The Shema and its surrounding commands fight against this drift. The words repeated morning and evening remind you. The symbols on hand and head mark you. The inscriptions on doorways greet you. You can't enter your house without encountering the text. You can't start your day without reciting the truth. The Lord is one. You must love with everything. This repetition isn't superstition. It's psychological wisdom. Identity is maintained through practice. Commitment is renewed through ritual. Memory is kept alive through constant retelling. Moses understands that ideas alone don't survive. They need bodies, voices, actions, rhythms of life. The Shema must become muscle memory, not just believed, but embodied. The political dimension intensifies when you consider the alternatives. What happens when loyalty divides? When people worship the Lord but also Baal? When they bring offerings to the Lord but also consult the spirits of the dead? When they swear by the Lord but also by Molech? Divided loyalty creates political chaos. Whose authority takes precedence? Which god gets the first fruits? What happens when the gods disagree? How do you build a coherent society when the fundamental source of authority is multiple? The Shema solves this by making division impossible. The Lord is one. Therefore, loyalty must be one. Therefore, the people must be one. The theological claim grounds political unity. But there's more. The command to love the Lord with all your heart appears in a treaty context. Moses is presenting the covenant, the relationship between the Lord and the people. And at the center of this treaty isn't fear or obligation or transaction. It's love. This transforms everything. Obedience flows from affection, not coercion. Law becomes the expression of relationship, not the burden of slavery. The commands are gift, not curse. Ways to maintain intimacy with the one who brought you out of bondage. Think about what this means practically. A soldier on the battlefield. He faces a choice. Fight for his people or flee to save himself. If his loyalty comes from fear, he calculates risk. If his loyalty comes from obligation, he measures duty. But if his loyalty comes from love, he acts from a different place entirely. A merchant in the marketplace. She can cheat her customer or deal honestly. If honesty is just law, she weighs the likelihood of getting caught. But if honesty flows from loving the Lord with all her strength, it becomes identity, who she is, not just what she does. The Shema creates a people whose obedience emerges from the heart, not just external pressure. This makes the community both more stable and more voluntary. You can't force love. You can only invite it, nurture it, model it, call it forth. Moses stands on the plains of Moab and calls it forth. Hear, O people, the Lord is one. You must love him with everything you have, everything you are, everything you might become. This is your identity, your purpose, your survival. In a world of divided powers and fragmented loyalties, you will be singular, unified, whole. In a culture that spreads devotion across many altars, you will focus yours on one. In a political landscape of shifting alliances, you will maintain one exclusive treaty. The Shema is prayer, confession, battle cry, constitution. 6 words that would echo through millennia. 6 words that would define what it means to be the people of the Lord. 6 words that turn theology into politics and politics into love. The Sinai retelling, laws as a national origin story. Moses doesn't just give commands. He tells stories. Deuteronomy chapters 1 through 4 recount the journey from Horeb to Moab. But this isn't simple history. Moses is shaping memory, selecting details, emphasizing certain moments while downplaying others. He's turning the past into a founding narrative. Every nation has origin stories. Roma had Romulus and Remus. Athens had Athena's victory over Poseidon. Egypt had the gods shaping civilization from chaos. These stories define identity, explain purpose. justify existence. The people standing before Moses need their own story. They're about to become a nation. They need to know where they came from, why they're different, what they're meant to be. So Moses takes them back to Horeb, back to the mountain, back to the moment everything changed. But notice how he tells it. The account differs from Exodus in subtle but significant ways. The differences aren't contradictions. They're interpretations. Moses is giving the second generation their version of events, a version shaped for their needs. At Horeb, the people stood at the base of the mountain. Fire blazed on the summit. Smoke rose. Thunder crashed. The voice of the Lord spoke from the flames. The people heard words but saw no form, only fire, only voice, only overwhelming presence. Moses emphasizes this. You saw no shape, no image, no physical representation, just words emerging from fire. Why stress this? Because across the Jordan, the people will encounter Canaanite religion, idols everywhere, carved images, stone representations, physical embodiment of divine power. The temptation will be strong to make their own images, to give the invisible God visible form. Moses is preempting this. At the founding moment, at the defining event of national birth, the Lord revealed himself as voice, not form, words, not images, sound, not sight. The law itself came this way. 10 words spoken directly to the people, not mediated through Moses at first, not written on tablets initially, spoken aloud. The entire nation heard them together. This matters for legitimacy. Moses isn't claiming private revelation. He's not presenting himself as the sole conduit. The people heard the law themselves. They were present. They are witnesses. But then something happened. The fire terrified them. The voice overwhelmed them. The proximity to holiness felt dangerous. The people begged Moses to mediate. You speak to us, and we will listen, but don't let the Lord speak to us directly, or we'll perish. Moses presents this as wise fear, proper recognition of divine transcendence. The people understood their limits. They knew they needed a mediator. They accepted Moses into that role voluntarily. This legitimizes his authority. He's not seizing power. The people gave it to him, begged him to take it. His position as intermediary comes from their request, not his ambition. The Lord approved. Moses went up the mountain alone, stayed 40 days, received the full law, returned with tablets of stone, the 10 words written by the divine finger. But here's where Moses reshapes the story. In Exodus, he comes down the mountain and finds the golden calf. The tablets shatter. Moses grinds the calf to powder. 3,000 people are slain. It's a catastrophe. Deuteronomy mentions the golden calf, but the focus shifts. Moses emphasizes the intercession, how he pleaded with the Lord, how he fasted 40 days, how he stood between the people and divine wrath, how the Lord relented because Moses intervened. The message to this second generation is clear. Your parents failed. They rebelled at the defining moment. They broke the covenant before the ink dried. They deserved destruction, but Moses saved them. His intercession bought them time, gave them another chance, extended the grace that allowed them to become your parents. You owe your existence to mercy. You stand here today because someone stood in the gap. Moses then describes receiving the law again. New tablets, same words. The covenant renewed, the relationship restored. This pattern of failure and renewal becomes central to Deuteronomy's message. The people will fail. That's assumed. The question isn't if, but when. And what happens after? Moses is teaching them repentance before they need it, showing them the path back before they wander off. building into their national memory the possibility of restoration. The law itself gets reframed in this retelling. In Exodus, it arrives in the context of a freed people learning to live as a community. Rules for a former slave population becoming a nation. In Deuteronomy, the law arrives as covenant condition. The terms of relationship. The requirements for remaining in the land they're about to enter. Same commands. Different framing. Exodus asks, how should a free people live? Deuteronomy asks, how can this people stay free? The shift is subtle but profound. The law moves from social instruction to national survival guide, from ethics to treaty terms, from wisdom to warning. Moses walks through the commands. The Sabbath, honoring parents, protection against harm to neighbors, truth in testimony, contentment with what you have. Each law connects to the relationship with the Lord. Each command reflects the character of the one who spoke from fire. Then he makes a stunning claim. These laws aren't burden, they're gift. They're what sets this people apart. Other nations will see these statutes and marvel. What other people has laws so just? What other nation has a God so near? Moses is building national pride based on law, identity rooted in justice, distinctiveness grounded in ethical standards. This is revolutionary. Most ancient peoples boasted about military might, territorial extent, wealth and monuments. Moses tells his people to boast about their legal system. Your glory is that you protect the weak, that you limit the powerful, that you bind rich and poor under the same standards, that your laws come from the one who brought you out of slavery and therefore understand what oppression means. This is who you are, a people defined by just law, a nation whose strength is measured by how it treats the vulnerable. Moses knows they're about to face kingdoms with impressive armies, fortified cities, established monarchies, accumulated wealth. The temptation will be to measure themselves by those standards, to value what their neighbors value, to pursue power and prestige and territory. He's giving them different metrics, better measures, truer markers of greatness. The Sinai story becomes foundation. The moment they were born as a people, the event that defines their purpose, the covenant that makes them who they are. But Moses doesn't present it as past only. He keeps saying us and we. He's collapsing time, making the second generation present at Sinai. They weren't there physically, but they're there legally. The covenant binds them as fully as it bound their parents. This is how origin stories work. They don't just describe the past. They pull the present back into the founding moment. Every generation stands at Sinai. Every hearer becomes a witness. The story doesn't age because each retelling makes it contemporary. Moses is handing this generation their national memory, their founding document, their origin story. You came from slavery. You were forged at a mountain. You heard the voice of the Lord. You received laws unlike any other nation. You were given identity and purpose and calling. Now you're about to step into your inheritance. The land waits. The promise is ready to be fulfilled. Remember where you came from. Remember what made you. Remember the fire and the voice and the words. Remember Sinai, because the land will test you. Prosperity will tempt you. Success will offer amnesia. But you are a people of the covenant, born at the mountain, defined by the law, chosen for a purpose. The story Moses tells isn't just history, it's identity. And identity determines destiny. The centralization revolution. One God, one altar, one people. Deuteronomy 12 drops a command that will reshape a nation. Destroy completely all the places where the nations you are dispossessing worship their gods. Break down their altars. Smash their sacred stones. Burn their wooden poles. Cut down the idols. Wipe out their names from those places. So far, this sounds like standard conquest ideology. Victors destroy the holy sites of the conquered. Nothing unusual. Then comes the revolution. You must not worship the Lord your God in their way. Instead, you must seek the place the Lord will choose from among all your tribes to put His name. There you must bring your offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, your special gifts. The place the Lord will choose. Singular. One location. In the ancient world, worship happened everywhere. Every hilltop, every grove, every spring. Each clan maintained its own altar. Each region had its sacred sites. Religion was local, decentralized, scattered across the landscape. The people leaving Egypt had spent 40 years in the wilderness. They worshipped at the tabernacle, a mobile sanctuary. Wherever it was pitched, that's where sacrifices happened. But the structure moved. The location changed. Flexibility defined the system. Now Moses says this ends. Once you cross the Jordan and settle in the land, once you have rest from enemies, everything changes. One place, one altar, one sanctuary. This isn't about convenience. This is political revolution, disguised as religious reform. Think about power in ancient tribal societies. Each region has its elders. Each clan has its leaders. Each family has its patriarch. Where do they derive authority? Partly from their connection to the sacred. The local elder maintains the local altar. The clan leader performs the local sacrifice. Control of ritual means control of people. Now Moses says, all that ends. Bring your offerings to the place the Lord chooses, not the place your family has always used, not the altar your grandfather built, not the high place where your clan has sacrificed for generations. One central location. This command concentrates power. If sacrifice can only happen at one altar, whoever controls that altar controls access to the Lord. If offerings must be brought to one place, that place becomes the economic hub. If festivals must be celebrated at one location, that location becomes a political center. Moses is building a nation-state from a tribal confederation. The command in chapter 12 is the mechanism, but he's careful about timing. Not yet, he says. First you must cross the Jordan. First you must defeat the inhabitants. First you must take possession. First you must have rest from surrounding enemies. Then the Lord will choose the place. The command has a future tense. This isn't for the wilderness. This isn't for the conquest. This is for when you're settled, when you're secure, when tribal structures have given way to something more unified. Moses knows immediate centralization would fail. The people are still organized by tribe. They're still thinking in terms of clan and family. The shift has to come gradually. The command plants the seed. Later generations will see it grow. And grow it did. Under King David, Jerusalem becomes the political capital. Under Solomon, the temple is built there. The place the Lord chose gets a name, an address, a permanent structure. But between Moses and Solomon lies a long period. The book of Judges describes widespread worship at local altars. Samuel sacrifices at multiple locations. Even after the temple is built, high places continue operating across the land. The centralization command exists in tension with practice for centuries. This tension drives the narrative of kings. Good kings suppress the high places. Bad kings tolerate or encourage them. The struggle to enforce Deuteronomy's vision runs through the entire monarchic period. Then Josiah, he reads the discovered scroll. He sees the command. He enforces it. The high places are destroyed. The local altars torn down. The regional priests brought to Jerusalem. For the first time in the nation's history, the Deuteronomic vision is fully implemented. But notice what this requires. It requires destroying sites people considered holy, sites their ancestors used, places associated with answered prayers and divine encounters, sites where Samuel himself once sacrificed. Deuteronomy anticipates resistance. You might say in your heart, "These nations worship their gods in these places, and I will do the same." No, you must not. Their practices led to horror, child sacrifice, cult prostitution, divination, sorcery. You must be completely different. The command to centralize connects to the command about uniqueness. One God demands one place. Singular deity requires singular altar. The theological claim drives the political program. There's an economic dimension, too. In a decentralized system, each region keeps its own resources. The tithe stays local. The offerings support local religious personnel. Wealth scatters across the landscape. Centralization changes this. Resources flow to the capital. The tithe supports a central priesthood. Wealth concentrates. This builds impressive structures, sustains a professional religious class, creates surplus for monumental architecture. Solomon's temple doesn't happen without centralization. The economic engine requires concentrated resources. The command in Deuteronomy makes the temple possible, but Moses includes safeguards. You may slaughter animals in your own towns for food. You don't have to travel to the central sanctuary just to eat meat. The distinction between sacred slaughter and ordinary slaughter gets established. This prevents the command from becoming impossibly burdensome. You must go to the central place for sacrifices, for vows, for first fruits, for tithes, but not for daily meals. The line gets drawn carefully. Sacred versus common, ritual versus routine. 3 times a year, all males must appear at the central sanctuary. 3 festivals, Passover, weeks, tabernacles. These become pilgrimage occasions, times when the scattered people gather, times when tribal identity gives way to national identity, times when farmers and craftsmen and merchants mix, share stories, build connections. The pilgrimage system creates national coherence. You meet people from other regions. You hear news from distant territories. You recognize shared identity across tribal lines. The central sanctuary becomes the place where the nation remembers its one people. Moses frames the command in terms of joy. You will rejoice before the Lord, you and your children, your servants, the Levites in your towns. Everyone participates. Everyone celebrates. The central sanctuary isn't burden, it's festival. Obligation becomes opportunity. But there's also warning. Be careful. Don't be enticed by foreign practices. Don't ask how other nations worship and then copy them. Don't add to the commands or subtract from them. The line between acceptable and forbidden must stay sharp. The command to centralize worship is really a command to maintain distinctiveness. As long as worship scatters across local sites, syncretism is easy. A little Baal worship here, some ancestor veneration there. Practices blur, boundaries soften, identity erodes. One altar prevents this. At the central sanctuary, standards can be maintained. Practices can be regulated. Teaching can be consistent. The priesthood can guard orthodoxy. Moses is creating a system that will preserve the covenant across generations, a structure that will keep the people distinct even when surrounded by other cultures, a mechanism for transmitting identity through time. One God, one altar, one people. The logic is elegant. The implementation will be bloody. Josiah's reforms require destroying what people love, centralizing what people want local, enforcing what people resist. But Moses sees further. He sees a people scattered among nations, a temple destroyed, altars gone, yet the identity surviving. How? Because the principle was already established. The Lord isn't bound to place. The chosen location can change. What matters is unity, coherence, singular focus. When the temple falls to Babylon, the people will already understand that worship can exist without multiplicity. One altar taught them that. When synagogues emerge in exile, the lesson holds. Different locations, but singular practice. Scattered geography, but unified identity. The centralization command plants seeds that will outlast its own implementation. The temple won't last, but the principle will. One God, one people, one focus. Moses stands on the plains of Moab and lays the foundation for a nation. The command seems narrow. One altar, one place. But the implications ripple through centuries. This is how you build something that lasts. Laws of war, creating an ethical army. Deuteronomy 20 addresses something no ancient law code treats with such complexity. How to conduct war ethically. Most ancient Near Eastern texts about warfare boast. King Ashurnasirpal of Assyria describes flaying captives alive. Egyptian reliefs show piles of severed hands. Conquest narratives celebrate total destruction without moral questioning. Moses takes a different approach. When you go to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army greater than yours, do not be afraid. The Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, will be with you. War begins with perspective. You're facing a stronger foe. The odds are against you. Fear is natural. But remember Egypt. Remember impossibility overcome. Remember that strength isn't measured by numbers. Then Moses introduces something unprecedented. Before battle, a priest approaches the troops. Not a general, not a king, a religious figure. The priest speaks. Hear, O warriors, today you go into battle. Do not let your hearts be faint. Do not fear or panic. The Lord your God goes with you to fight for you. This isn't pep talk. It's theology in the trenches. The army fights with divine presence. The outcome doesn't depend solely on human strength. This reframes violence, makes it sacred act, not mere conquest. Next come exemptions. Officers walk through the ranks asking questions. Has anyone built a new house but not dedicated it? Go home. Has anyone planted a vineyard but not enjoyed its fruit? Go home. Has anyone pledged to marry but not yet wed? Go home. Is anyone afraid or faint-hearted? Go home before your fear spreads to others. Think about what this does. Right before battle, soldiers are sent away. The army shrinks. Strength decreases. By any military logic, this is madness. But Moses is building something other than an efficient destruction machine. He's creating an army that values life, that recognizes legitimate reasons to avoid violence, that doesn't force participation from the unwilling. The man who built a house should enjoy it. The man who planted a vineyard deserves to taste its fruit. The man about to marry shouldn't die before his wedding. These are goods worth preserving. Life outweighs military necessity and fear. Fear is honest. The frightened soldier endangers everyone. Better he leaves. The army should consist of those who choose to fight, not those coerced. This creates a volunteer force, not conscription, not forced levy. Each soldier stands there by choice, having passed up legitimate reasons to leave. Then Moses distinguishes between types of warfare. Cities far from the land of Canaan receive offers of peace. If they accept, they become subjects. Pay tribute. Integrate into the nation's economy. War is avoided. If they refuse, siege follows. When the city falls, males are slain. Women, children, livestock, and goods become plunder. This is harsh. but it's also limited. Not total destruction, not indiscriminate slaughter. Specific categories. Rules even in violence. For Canaanite cities inside the Promised Land, the command intensifies. Complete destruction, no survivors. The reason given is theological. These nations practice abominations, child sacrifice, divination, sorcery. Their practices would corrupt the people. This is difficult text. Modern readers recoil. How is genocide ethical? The question is valid and troubling. But notice what Moses does even here. He gives reason. He explains purpose. This isn't arbitrary violence. This isn't cruelty for pleasure. This is preventive measure. The practices must be eliminated to protect the community's distinctiveness. The ancient world didn't question conquest. Every nation expanded when able. Power meant territory. Strength meant subjugation. Moses works within this framework while trying to limit its excesses. Even in Canaanite warfare, exceptions exist. Rahab survives because she helps the spies. The Gibeonites survive through treaty, even though gained by deception. The absolute commands have practical flexibility. Then comes an astonishing restriction. During siege, you may eat from the city's fruit trees, but you must not cut them down. Trees aren't your enemy. They'll provide food long after the battle ends. Destroying them is wasteful, short-sighted, wrong. This is environmental protection in military law. In the heat of siege, when frustration and anger run high, when the temptation is to destroy everything, Moses says no. Preserve the trees. They're innocent. They're useful. They'll outlast this conflict. The law treats trees with more consideration than some ancient codes treat people. After conquest comes integration. The captured woman, who becomes a wife, receives protections. She must be allowed to mourn her parents for a full month. If later the husband wants to divorce her, she goes free. She cannot be sold or treated as slave. Marriage creates obligation even when it begins in violence. This doesn't make the practice good, but it creates boundaries, limits, recognition of humanity even in the conquered. Moses is trying to prevent his people from becoming like the empires they fought. Egypt enslaved them. Canaan would have destroyed them. Assyria would flay them. Babylon would exile them. These empires treated conquered peoples as objects. Resources. Problems to eliminate. The laws in Deuteronomy fight against this. Even in war, you remain the people who were slaves. Even in victory, you remember oppression. Even with power, you maintain limits. The priest speaks before battle. This keeps the sacred visible. Reminds soldiers they fight under divine authority. They're not autonomous agents of destruction. They're covenant people acting within covenant boundaries. The exemptions before battle say life matters. Individual circumstances matter. A house, a vineyard, a marriage. These goods outweigh military efficiency. The offer of peace to distant cities says violence isn't preferred. Subjugation is better than destruction. Integration is better than elimination. The protection of trees says creation has value beyond human conflict. The land itself deserves consideration. The treatment of captured women says even in extreme power imbalance, humans retain dignity. Obligations exist. Limits apply. None of this makes ancient warfare acceptable by modern standards. The violence is still real. The destruction still happens. People still are slain. But Moses is working within his context while pushing against its worst impulses. He's trying to create an army that doesn't lose its soul in battle, a people who can exercise power without becoming the oppressor. The laws of war in Deuteronomy are laws of limitation, boundaries on violence, rules for restraint, Ethics in the midst of destruction. This is revolutionary, not because war becomes good, but because war becomes subject to law, answerable to higher authority, bounded by moral consideration. The army becomes extension of the covenant community, subject to the same Lord, bound by the same values. Violence doesn't create exception to ethics. Power doesn't exempt from responsibility. Moses addresses soldiers about to invade, about to fight, about to win, and he tells them how to remain human in the process. This is the ethical army, not perfect, not pacifist, but limited, accountable, aware that strength creates obligation. The priest speaks before battle. The trees remain standing after siege. And the people learn that even in violence, the covenant holds. The social safety net. Laws for the least of these. Deuteronomy chapter 15 opens with radical economics. At the end of every 7 years, you must cancel debts, not restructure, not reduce. Cancel completely. Everyone who owes money goes free. Debts are erased. Obligations end. The slate is wiped clean. In an agricultural economy, this is revolutionary. Debt drives the system. Poor harvests create borrowing. Borrowing creates obligation. Obligation creates dependence. Over time, the gap between wealthy and poor becomes permanent. The debtor class becomes hereditary. Moses says, no. Every 7 years, reset. The economic hierarchy cannot become fixed. Poverty cannot become permanent status. The system must include regular opportunity for fresh start. But human nature resists this. Be careful not to harbor wicked thoughts. Do not say to yourself, the 7th year is near, and refuse to lend to your needy neighbor. Moses anticipates the loophole. If debt cancels in the 7th year, why lend in the 6th? The poor person needs the loan most right before the cancellation. That's precisely when lending becomes risky. So the law commands against rational self-interest. Lend anyway. Give freely. Don't calculate the risk. The Lord will bless the generosity. This creates a counter-economy, an alternative to market logic. A system where helping the poor isn't weighed against potential loss, where generosity operates outside profit motive. Then comes the ideal. There should be no poor among you. Moses immediately qualifies. There will always be poor people in the land. This seems contradictory. Should be none, but will always be some. What's happening here? Moses is setting both goal and reality. The goal is a society where poverty doesn't exist. The economic structure should prevent it. The Sabbath year, the Jubilee, the tithe system, the gleaning laws, all these mechanisms work toward eliminating poverty. But human sin will prevent the ideal. People will cheat, hoard, exploit, ignore the commands, so there will always be poor. Therefore, a backup system, since the ideal won't be reached. Make provision for the inevitable. Be open-handed toward your fellow people and toward the poor and needy in your land. Generosity becomes obligation, not charity, not optional kindness. Required response to systemic failure to achieve the goal. Servitude receives similar treatment. A fellow Hebrew becomes your servant because of debt. After 6 years, you must let them go free. No strings, no continued obligation. And when you release them, don't send them away empty-handed. Supply them liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, your winepress. Give them means for new start. Give as the Lord has given you. Moses grounds this in memory. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. The command isn't abstract principle. It's concrete remembering. You know what servitude feels like. You experienced powerlessness. You were released without earning freedom. Now you have power. Use it like the Lord used his. Release freely. Supply generously. Transform the one who served you into one who can start again. The servant can choose to stay if he loves you and your household. If he's well off with you, he can become permanent servant. The ritual involves his ear and a doorpost. Physical marking of voluntary choice. But the choice is his. Agency remains with the one who has least power. The firstborn animals receive instruction. They belong to the Lord. They must be sacrificed at the central sanctuary. You eat them there with your household. This becomes festival celebration, the best of the flock shared in sacred space. But if the animal has defect, you don't sacrifice it. You eat it at home. Lame or blind animals aren't suitable offerings. This protects the poor. They can eat valuable meat without the expense of travel to the central sanctuary. Then come the 3 pilgrimage festivals: Passover, Weeks, Tabernacles. All males must appear at the central sanctuary, but they must not appear empty-handed. Each person brings a gift in proportion to the Lord's blessing. The festivals become wealth redistribution. The prosperous bring much. The poor bring little. But everyone participates. Everyone shares. The central sanctuary feast includes the whole community. Tabernacles get special emphasis. Celebrate the festival for 7 days. Be joyful. You, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, the Levites, the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns. Notice who's listed: the standard family, the servants, the religious personnel, the immigrants, the orphans, the widows. The festival includes everyone. The celebration crosses economic boundaries. This is community formation through shared joy. The wealthy don't feast separately. The poor don't watch from outside. Everyone participates. Everyone celebrates. Everyone belongs. The command to be joyful appears twice. This isn't grim duty. This isn't burden. This is party, feast, celebration of harvest and blessing and survival. Joy becomes equalizer. Rich and poor can share the same emotion. Power differences fade in common celebration. The festival creates what daily life fractures. The treatment of the foreigner continues throughout. The immigrant receives specific protection. When you harvest, leave gleanings. When you beat your olive trees, don't go over branches twice. When you harvest grapes, don't pick up what falls. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. This builds waste into the system. Inefficiency becomes obligation. You can't extract every bit of value from your field. Some must remain for those without land. Moses keeps repeating the triad: foreigner, fatherless, widow. These are the vulnerable, the ones without normal social protection. The immigrant has no ancestral land. The orphan has no father's inheritance. The widow has no husband's provision. In a patriarchal society built on father-to-son transmission, these 3 fall through the cracks. So the law creates special attention, repeated protection, constant reminder. The tithe system includes them. Every 3rd year, the tithe stays local. It feeds the Levites who have no land, the foreigners who have no inheritance, the fatherless who have no family, the widows who have no husbands. This is systematic welfare, not emergency aid, not occasional charity, regular, predictable provision for those the system excludes. Moses is building a society where poverty is addressed structurally, not through individual kindness alone, though that's commanded too, but through laws that create regular redistribution, that prevent permanent hierarchy, that include the excluded. The 7th-year release prevents debt slavery from becoming permanent. The servant release prevents servitude from becoming hereditary. The gleaning laws provide immediate food. The 3rd-year tithe provides regular support. The festival inclusion provides communal belonging. layer upon layer, system upon system, each addressing different aspect of poverty, each preventing different form of exploitation, and each grounded in memory. You were slaves. You were foreigners in Egypt. You know oppression from the inside. Now you have power. Now you have land. Now you have wealth. Use it differently. Build something better. Create a society where the vulnerable receive protection not from individual kindness alone, but from the structure itself. This is the social safety net. Not charity, justice. Not optional kindness, required community care. Moses tells people about to inherit wealth to build poverty relief into the foundation. Before they get comfortable, before they forget, before power makes them indifferent. The least of these have names in Deuteronomy: foreigner, fatherless, widow, and they have protections, multiple, overlapping, systematic protections. This is what it means to be the people who were slaves, who know what oppression tastes like, who must never become the oppressor. The safety net isn't perfection. People will still suffer. The system will still fail. But the attempt is made. The vision is cast. The goal is set. There should be no poor among you, and until that day, generosity is law. The revolutionary justice system, courts, witnesses, and limits. Deuteronomy chapter 16 shifts from social welfare to legal procedure. The justice system receives detailed attention. Appoint judges and officials for each of your tribes in every town the Lord your God is giving you. They must judge the people fairly. Local courts, not centralized authority, not distant bureaucracy. Justice administered in the communities where people live. This is radical decentralization. Each town gets its own judges. Each tribe maintains its own officials. Legal authority scatters across the landscape. No single power center controls all decisions. The command emphasizes fairness. Do not pervert justice or show partiality. Do not accept bribes, for bribes blind the eyes of the wise and twist the words of the innocent. Moses anticipates corruption. Judges will be tempted. The wealthy will offer money. The powerful will demand favor. Family connections will create pressure. So the law establishes principle. Justice must be impartial. The rich and poor receive the same treatment. The powerful and weak stand equal before the court. Bribes get specific prohibition. Not just wrong, dangerous. They blind even wise judges. They twist words of the righteous. Corruption spreads from the one who gives to the one who receives, affecting everyone who depends on the system. Then comes the famous declaration: follow justice, and justice alone, so that you may live and possess the land the Lord your God is giving you. Justice isn't luxury. It's survival requirement. The land depends on justice. Without it, everything falls apart. Corrupt courts don't just hurt people. They threaten the nation's very existence. Fair judgment, though? It allows the inheritance to continue. This ties justice directly to the covenant. The people get to stay in the land, but there's a condition. Actually, several conditions. One of them is righteous judgment. When justice gets twisted, the covenant breaks. When courts stay fair, the covenant holds. For the really difficult cases, there's a higher court. If something comes before your local court that's too hard to judge, you go up to the place God chose. The central sanctuary isn't just for worship. It has a judicial function too. Priests and a judge examine the case together. They make their decision. And that decision is final, binding, no appeals. This creates a two-tier system. Most cases get handled locally. The complex ones go to the central court. Authority flows from local to central when it's needed, not the other way around. Anyone who shows contempt for that central court's decision faces severe consequences. This protects the whole system. Because think about it. Without final authority, legal questions never end. Disputes just keep going forever. The central court brings closure. But notice the safeguard built in. The central court has both priests and a judge, religious authority and civic authority. This prevents all the power from concentrating in one role. Checks and balances, right at the highest level. Witnesses get crucial attention in this system. One witness isn't enough to convict someone. A matter has to be established by 2 or 3 witnesses. This is extraordinary protection. One person's word doesn't cut it. You need multiple testimonies, independent confirmation, evidence that lines up. Think about what this prevents. Personal vendettas become harder. False accusations become harder. Mistaken identity, convenient scapegoating, all of it gets harder when you require multiple witnesses. The law goes further. If a malicious witness testifies falsely, both parties have to stand before God. Before the priests and judges, the judges investigate thoroughly, and if the witness is proven to be lying, they get what they tried to give. The false witness receives the exact punishment they intended for the accused. Try to frame someone for theft? You get the punishment for theft. Falsely accuse someone of violence? You get the penalty for violence. This creates a powerful deterrent. Lying in court isn't low risk anymore. The consequences fall right back on the liar. The punishment fits the crime they attempted. The command ends with this: show no pity. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Sounds harsh, right? But read it carefully. This is a proportionality principle. The punishment has to match the crime, not exceed it, not fall short. Exact equivalence. In a world where vengeance keeps escalating, this is actually a limitation. Family feuds spiral out of control all the time. One injury leads to bigger retaliation. Bigger retaliation leads to wholesale slaughter. Tribal warfare emerges from individual disputes. Moses says, "Stop. A for A. Only an eye. Not a life for an eye. Not a whole family for an eye." Precise equivalence. This caps vengeance, limits retaliation, prevents escalation. But there's more to it. The principle also prevents excessive leniency. The powerful can't buy their way out. The wealthy can't just pay instead of facing punishment. Rich and poor face the same consequence. This is equality before the law. The standard applies to everyone. Status doesn't create an exemption. Wealth doesn't purchase immunity. Even corporal punishment gets regulated. If someone guilty of a capital offense is executed and their body is exposed on a pole, you can't leave it there overnight. Bury it that same day, because anyone hung on a pole is under divine curse. Even the executed retain dignity. The body must be buried, not left to decay, not treated like garbage. Human life keeps its value even after the legal process ends. This principle extends to flogging, too. If someone deserves a beating, the judge makes them lie down. They get flogged right there, in the judge's presence. The number of lashes matches what the crime deserves. But here's the limit. The judge cannot impose more than 40 lashes. If more are given, your fellow person gets degraded in your eyes. Punishment has limits. 40 lashes maximum. Not 50. Not 60. Not whatever the judge feels like. 40. Fixed. Clear. The reasoning behind this is profound. Excessive punishment degrades people. It reduces a human being to an object. It makes a spectacle out of suffering. The community watches the punishment and sees a fellow human stripped of dignity. Moses says no. Even the guilty still belong to the community. Even the punished still have humanity. Limits exist because humans have intrinsic worth. The judicial system in Deuteronomy creates accountability at every single level. Local judges answer to the central court. Witnesses face severe penalties for lying. Judges who show partiality violate the covenant. Punishments must match crimes exactly. This is government by law, not by person. Rules apply to everyone. Standards bind everyone. Power submits to principle. Moses knows human nature. He knows judges will be tempted. He knows witnesses will lie. He knows the powerful will press their advantage. He knows corruption will seep in. He knows the system will fail. So he builds redundancy. Multiple witnesses, local and central courts, religious and civic authority, proportional punishment, dignity for the condemned, layer upon layer of protection, not because one layer will definitely hold, but because the combination might, not because humans are trustworthy, but because structures can limit untrustworthiness. The justice system in Deuteronomy isn't optimistic about human nature, but it's committed to justice anyway. It assumes corruption and builds against it. It expects failure and creates safeguards. This is mature legal thinking, not idealistic, not cynical, realistic, working with the human tendency toward injustice while insisting on justice anyway. The land depends on it. The covenant requires it. The community needs it. Follow justice and justice alone, so that you may live the king's law. A constitution written to limit monarchy. Deuteronomy chapter 17 contains something unprecedented in the ancient world. A constitution for a king, written before the monarchy even exists. When you enter the land God is giving you, when you've taken possession and settled in it, you're going to say something. Let us set a king over us, like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint a king the Lord your God chooses. Moses anticipates the request. Not if you want a king. When you want one, the desire for monarchy is expected, predicted. The people will look at the surrounding nations and want similar structures. This is profound psychological insight. Humans compare themselves. We measure ourselves against others. We want what our neighbors have. The nations around them have kings. Impressive kings. Powerful kings. Eventually, they'll want one too. Moses doesn't forbid this, but he establishes conditions. The king must be chosen by God. He must come from among your own people, not a foreigner, not someone outside the covenant community. Then come the restrictions, and these restrictions are revolutionary. The king must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself. He must not make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. Horses represent military power, chariots, cavalry, impressive warfare capability. Egypt has vast horse breeding operations. A king wanting military strength would naturally turn there. Moses says no. The king must not accumulate military hardware, must not build an army based on impressive technology, must not create ties with Egypt through trade and weapons. This limits the king's capacity for aggression, for conquest, for expansion. A king without horses is a king who can't project power far beyond his borders. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. Multiple wives signal political alliances. Ancient Near Eastern diplomacy works through marriage. A king marries the daughter of a neighboring ruler. This seals the treaty, creates family ties, binds nations together. Each marriage brings the wife's gods into the palace. Her religious practices, her cultural influences. Many wives mean many foreign influences, many competing loyalties, Moses prohibits this. The king must not use marriage for political alliance. His heart must remain undivided. His loyalty must stay focused. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. Wealth enables everything else. With enough money, you buy horses. You support many wives. You build monuments. You fund armies. You exercise power. Moses caps wealth accumulation. The king must not become vastly rich, must not concentrate resources, must not build an economic empire. These three restrictions target specific royal temptations: horses, wives, wealth. They prevent the king from becoming like the pharaohs, like the emperors, like the god-kings who rule through overwhelming power. Think about who this describes. Solomon, David's son, the king who built the temple, the wise ruler, the Golden Age monarch. Solomon acquired horses, many horses. He established trade with Egypt, built chariot cities, created cavalry forces. Solomon took many wives, 700 wives of royal birth, 300 concubines, political alliances through marriage. His wives turned his heart after other gods. Solomon accumulated wealth, vast wealth. Gold flowed into Jerusalem. Silver became as common as stones. His kingdom grew wealthy through trade and tribute. Solomon violated every single restriction Moses established, and the kingdom fell apart after his death. Divided, weakened, never to reunite. Moses, writing centuries before Solomon, describes exactly what will go wrong. The Constitution includes its own critique. The limits exist because without them, monarchy becomes tyranny. But Moses isn't finished. When the king takes the throne, he has to write something for himself. On a scroll, a copy of this law. The king must be the scribe, must copy the law with his own hand, not have it copied for him, not receive a finished copy, must write it himself. Imagine this: the most powerful person in the nation sitting with a scroll and ink, copying law word by word, letter by letter. The physical act of writing creates intimacy with the text. As his hand forms the letters, his mind processes the words. As he copies the restrictions on royal power, he internalizes them. The law becomes part of him through the act of transcription. It has to be with him. He has to read it all the days of his life. Daily reading. The king must engage the law constantly, not once, not occasionally, every day. The scroll must travel with him, remain accessible, be consulted regularly. This creates accountability. The king isn't above the law. He's subject to it. Daily reading reminds him the restrictions aren't suggestions. They're requirements, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God. Follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees. The purpose is humility. The king learns reverence through reading, learns his place through studying limitations, learns that power comes with boundaries, and not consider himself better than his fellow people, not turn from the law to the right or to the left. The king remains part of the community, not separate, not special, not exempt. He's a fellow person who happens to hold office. Office doesn't elevate him beyond the covenant. It binds him more tightly to it. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom. Longevity comes through submission to law. Dynasties last when kings remain humble. Power perpetuates when it's properly limited. This is constitutional monarchy, limited executive power, rule bound by written law, authority exercised under divine oversight. In a world of absolute monarchs, this is revolution. The king of Assyria claims divine status. The Pharaoh of Egypt is considered a god. The rulers of Babylon exercise unchecked power. Moses describes a king who copies law, who reads daily, who accepts limits, who remains equal to his people in all but office. The ancient Near East has nothing like this. Kings make law. They don't submit to it. Kings establish rules. They don't follow them. Kings are the law. They don't read it. Deuteronomy inverts this completely. Law precedes the king. Law limits the king. Law outlasts the king. The king is temporary. The law is permanent. This has implications far beyond ancient monarchies. The principle is clear. Power requires limitation. Authority needs boundaries. Leadership demands accountability. The mechanisms are specific. Written law, public reading, personal copying. These aren't abstract ideals. They're practical requirements. Things you can measure. Things you can enforce. Moses creates the first constitutional government. Executive power exists, but it's bound, regulated, subject to higher authority. The king serves the law. The law doesn't serve the king. This principle echoes through history. Magna Carta, Constitutional Convention, Bills of Rights, separation of powers. All of it flows from this insight. Power must submit to law. Moses writes it before the first king takes the throne, before the monarchy even exists. He's establishing the principle in advance. So when the time comes, when the people demand a king, the framework is already there. The conditions are set. The limits are clear. The requirements are written. Horses, wives, wealth. The temptations are named. The restrictions are explicit. Copy the law. Read it daily. Remember, you're human. This is how you prevent tyranny. This is how you make power serve people. This is how you build government that lasts. One king writes the law. One king reads daily. One king remembers his place. And the kingdom endures. Prophets like Moses. The ultimate check on power. Deuteronomy chapter 18 addresses something critical. What happens when all the systems fail? The king has his constitution. The judges have their courts. The priests have their rituals. The people have their laws. But what if everyone becomes corrupt? What if the entire structure turns rotten? Moses provides an answer. The prophet. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me, from among you, from your fellow people. You must listen to him. A prophet like Moses. This is an enormous claim. Moses is the standard, the lawgiver, the mediator, the one who spoke with God face to face. Now he says someone will come who functions like he did. This prophet will emerge from the community, not foreign, not distant, not separate, from among your fellow people, accessible, present. One of you, the prophet, will speak for God. Direct words, divin message, not interpretation, not commentary, the actual voice of God channeled through a human mouth. But this creates a problem. Anyone can claim to speak for God. False prophets will emerge. Deceivers, manipulators, people wanting power or attention or wealth. How do you distinguish the true prophet from the false? Moses gives two tests. First, the prophecy must come true. If a prophet speaks in the Lord's name and the thing doesn't happen, that prophet has spoken presumptuously. Don't be afraid of him. This is empirical verification. Wait and see. Does reality confirm the message? If yes, listen. If no, ignore. But there's a second, more subtle test. The prophet must call people back to the covenant. If a prophet performs signs and wonders, but then says, "Let us follow other gods," don't listen. Even if the prediction comes true, even if the miracle happens, truth isn't measured only by accurate prediction. It's measured by alignment with the revealed law. The prophet must be consistent with what God already said. New revelation can't contradict the Old Covenant. This creates boundaries. The prophet has freedom to speak new words, address current situations, apply law to novel circumstances. But the prophet can't overturn the foundation, can't introduce foreign gods, can't undermine the covenant. Why does Moses establish this office? Because he knows what's coming. The king will fail. He'll accumulate horses, wives, wealth. He'll turn from the law. The dynasty will corrupt. The judges will fail. They'll accept bribes, show partiality, pervert justice. The courts will become tools of the powerful. The priests will fail. They'll perform rituals mechanically, forget the meaning, tolerate mixed worship. The worship will become empty. When all the formal structures fail, the prophet will speak, outside the system, beyond institutional control, answerable only to God. This is the ultimate check on power. Not another institution, not another office within the structure, but a voice from outside, calling the entire system back to its foundation. Think about how prophets actually functioned. Elijah confronted King Ahab. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and followed the Baals. Direct challenge to royal authority. No institutional backing, just the word of the Lord. Nathan confronted King David. You are the man, calling out the king's abuse of power, his taking of Bathsheba, his arranging Uriah's death. The king could have removed Nathan, but the prophet spoke anyway. Isaiah confronted King Ahaz, warned against political alliances, called for trust in the Lord instead of military pacts. The king didn't listen. The prophet spoke truth regardless. Jeremiah faced multiple kings, warned of coming judgment, called for repentance, was imprisoned, threatened, dropped in a cistern, yet continued prophesying. The prophet operates without institutional protection, without formal authority, without guaranteed audience, just the message and the conviction that it comes from the Lord. This is dangerous, both for the prophet and for the community. The prophet risks everything: rejection, persecution, violence. The community risks following false prophets, being led astray, making terrible decisions based on false words. But Moses establishes the office anyway, because the alternative is worse. A system with no external critique, power with no prophetic challenge, institutions with no voice calling them back to first principles. The prophet is the covenant's immune system. When infection enters, the prophet activates, identifies the threat, calls for response. Sometimes the body listens. Sometimes it doesn't. But the warning is given. The prophet like Moses will emerge. Future tense. Not Moses himself. Someone after. Someone who continues his function. Speaks as he spoke. Mediates as he mediated. Jewish tradition debated who this meant. Some said Joshua. Some said Samuel. Some said each generation has its prophet. Some said Elijah, who would return. Some said a future Messiah. Christian tradition saw Jesus as the fulfillment. The prophet like Moses, who spoke divine words, who performed signs, who called people back to covenant, who mediated new relationship with God. But regardless of interpretation, the principle holds. The community needs voices from outside the system, people who aren't invested in maintaining structures, who can speak truth regardless of consequence. The prophet has no territory to protect, no wealth to preserve, no position to maintain, just the word. This makes the prophet both powerful and vulnerable. Powerful because unconstrained by institutional limits. Vulnerable because without institutional protection, kings can remove judges. Priests can silence other priests. But the prophet? The prophet just keeps speaking. As long as the message remains, the prophet's voice continues. Moses establishes this, knowing he won't be there. The people will need someone to perform his function, not his role exactly, not his unique status, but his voice, his challenge, his call back to covenant. The prophet will emerge when needed, from among the people, speaking words the institutions don't want to hear, calling power to account, reminding everyone what was promised, what was required, what was at stake. This is the ultimate check, not another branch of government, not balanced powers within the system, but a voice outside, beyond control, speaking truth. The prophet like Moses will come. The community must listen, even when uncomfortable, even when challenging, even when it costs. Because sometimes the only thing that saves a community is the voice willing to tell it the truth it doesn't want to hear. The blessing and the curse. The cosmic treaty format. Stand with me on two mountains. Mount Gerizim rises green and fertile on one side. Mount Ebal looms dark and barren on the other. Between them stretches a natural amphitheater in the land of Canaan, where sound carries with impossible clarity from peak to valley floor. Moses commands the tribes to divide. 6 tribes climb Gerizim. 6 ascend Ebal. The Levites stand in the center, their voices about to pronounce words that will echo through millennia. This ceremony appears bizarre to modern readers. Why divide a nation between 2 mountains? Why shout blessings and curses across a valley? The answer lies buried in the diplomatic archives of the ancient Near East. In treaties written on clay tablets centuries before Moses spoke these words. Ancient empires didn't conquer through military might alone. They bound vassal nations through formal treaties, documents that followed precise patterns. A great king would begin by listing his titles and mighty deeds. Then came the historical prologue, recounting how he had saved or benefited the vassal. Next appeared the treaty stipulations, the laws the vassal must follow. Finally, the most crucial section, blessings for obedience, curses for rebellion. These treaties were not mere political documents. They invoked the gods as witnesses. They described cosmic consequences for breaking faith. Deuteronomy follows this pattern with stunning precision. The opening chapters list God's identity and past acts of rescue. The historical sections recount the Exodus and wilderness wanderings. The central chapters lay out the stipulations, the laws governing every aspect of life. Now, in chapters 26 through 28, come the blessings and curses. But Moses does something revolutionary. He transforms the treaty format from a tool of imperial domination into a covenant of mutual commitment. The great king here is not a tyrant demanding tribute. The relationship offered is deeper than political submission. The treaty terms bind God as much as they bind the people. The blessings come first. They cascade through every dimension of human existence. The fruit of your womb will flourish. Your crops will overflow. Your livestock will multiply. Your enemies will flee before you. Rain will fall in its season. Your storehouses will burst with abundance. Other nations will see your prosperity and recognize divine favor. These are not ethereal, spiritual rewards. They are concrete, measurable outcomes. A farmer could look at his fields and know whether the covenant held. A woman could count her children and understand her place within the treaty. The blessings root the abstract concept of faithfulness in the soil, in the womb, in the daily rhythms of survival and flourishing. The structure matters deeply. Ancient treaties placed curses first, using fear as the primary motivator. Moses reverses this. Hope precedes warning. The vision of life in harmony with divine purpose comes before the shadow of its opposite. This subtle shift transforms the entire framework, from intimidation to invitation. Then come the curses. They mirror the blessings with terrible symmetry. Where crops overflowed, now drought withers the grain. Where children multiplied, now barrenness spreads. Where victory came easily, now enemies press close. Disease, defeat, exile. Each curse precisely negates a corresponding blessing. The language intensifies as the curses progress. They become increasingly specific and visceral. You will eat the fruit of your own womb in desperation during siege. You will be scattered among nations, and find no rest for the sole of your foot. A trembling heart and failing eyes will follow you. Morning will bring the wish for evening, evening the wish for morning. These curses are not arbitrary punishments invented by an angry deity. They describe the natural consequences of social collapse. When communities abandon laws protecting the vulnerable, when justice becomes corrupted, when worship of power replaces worship of the divine, societies unravel in predictable patterns. The curses trace this unraveling with brutal honesty. The treaty format requires witnesses. Ancient kings called upon their gods to observe the oath. Moses calls upon heaven and earth themselves. The cosmos becomes the courtroom. The mountains serve as jury. Every element of creation watches as the people choose. This raises the ceremony on Gerizim and Ebal from ritual to cosmic drama. The tribes standing on those peaks represent all humanity, standing between blessing and curse, between life aligned with creation's purpose and life at war with it. The choice echoes through the valley and beyond, into every generation that will follow. The ceremony also creates public accountability. Everyone hears the same words. No one can claim ignorance later. The blessings and curses are not secret knowledge held by priests. They belong to the entire community, witnessed by all, binding on all. Ancient treaties included elaborate instructions for preserving and displaying the document. Vassal kings had to deposit copies in temples. Read them publicly at regular intervals. Teach them to their children. Moses commands the same. The words must be written on large stones, plastered and inscribed clearly. They must be read aloud every 7 years when the people gather. They must be taught constantly, sitting at home, walking on the road, lying down, rising up. This transforms the treaty from a single event into an ongoing relationship. Each generation must hear the terms again. Each person must personally choose whether to accept them. The covenant cannot be inherited passively. It demands active, conscious renewal. The treaty format also explains Deuteronomy's repetitive nature. Modern readers wonder why Moses repeats the same laws and warnings multiple times. Ancient treaty texts did this deliberately. Repetition served legal, pedagogical, and rhetorical purposes. It ensured understanding. It emphasized importance. It created memorable rhythms that aided memorization in oral cultures. The curses in Deuteronomy 28 stretch for 54 verses, more than twice the length of the blessings. This imbalance troubles many readers. Does it suggest a God more eager to punish than to bless? The treaty format provides context. The extensive curses reflect reality, not divine temperament. Building a just society requires constant effort and vigilance. Destroying one happens almost automatically through neglect and corruption. The length of the curses acknowledges this asymmetry. The treaty also contains a hidden mechanism for hope. Near the end of the curse section, after describing total national collapse and exile, Moses inserts a promise. Even in the farthest exile, if you return to the covenant, restoration will come. The great king will not abandon the treaty relationship permanently. This provision appears in few ancient treaties. Vassal kings who rebelled could expect annihilation, not reconciliation. Moses plants seeds of hope in the darkest soil. The cosmic scope of the treaty raises questions about divine justice. If curses follow disobedience, why do the innocent suffer alongside the guilty? Ancient treaties operated collectively. The vassal king's actions brought consequences on his entire nation. Moses works within this framework while subtly modifying it. Later passages in Deuteronomy emphasize individual responsibility. Parents don't die for children's sins, nor children for parents. The tension between collective and individual accountability runs through the entire book. The ceremony itself creates a watershed moment. Before this day, the people existed in transit, suspended between slavery and promise. After this ceremony, they become a treaty nation with defined terms, clear expectations, cosmic stakes. The mountains witness their transformation from refugee tribes into a covenant community. The blessings and curses also function as diagnostic tools. Future generations will be able to examine their circumstances and understand their relationship to the covenant. Prosperity suggests faithfulness. Disaster prompts examination of conscience. This creates a framework for making sense of history, for finding meaning in both triumph and catastrophe. But the treaty format contains a problem. It suggests a transactional relationship. Obedience earns blessing. Disobedience brings curse. This mechanical view contradicts experience. Righteous people suffer. The wicked prosper. Later biblical books like Job and Ecclesiastes wrestle with this tension. The treaty format provides a framework, not a complete theology. The ceremony on Gerizim and Ebal never actually happens in Deuteronomy's narrative. Moses commands it for after the Jordan crossing. The book of Joshua records its fulfillment. This gap matters. The treaty becomes effective not when spoken, but when enacted. The people must physically stand on those mountains and shout their commitment. Covenant requires embodied participation, not mere intellectual assent. The treaty form also reveals why Deuteronomy could ignite Josiah's revolution 6 centuries later. When the high priest finds the scroll in the temple, he doesn't discover ancient history. He uncovers a living contract, still binding, with terms that could be checked against current reality. The curses map perfectly onto Judah's declining fortunes. The treaty becomes a mirror, showing the nation its true face. This cosmic treaty transforms law from burden into choice. The commands are not arbitrary restrictions imposed by power. They are the terms of a relationship, the conditions for flourishing, the path between the mountain of blessing and the mountain of curse. Each generation stands again in that valley, hearing the echo of voices from both peaks, and must choose which mountain their lives will climb. Moses' song, the final devastating prophecy. Moses knows how this story ends, not through divine revelation alone, but through bitter human wisdom. He has led these people for 40 years. He knows their hearts. He knows the seductive power of settled life, of prosperity, of forgetting. So in the final days, he doesn't give them another sermon. He gives them a song. Songs embed themselves in memory differently than speeches. A well-crafted song becomes indelible. Its rhythms and rhymes create grooves in the mind that resist erosion. You can forget a lecture, but a song you learned in childhood stays with you until death. Moses, the prophet who claimed he was not eloquent, becomes a poet in his final act. The song begins with invocation. Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak. Let the earth hear the words of my mouth. The cosmic witnesses summoned for the treaty ceremony return. But now they will hear, not terms and conditions, but tragedy. Moses presents God first, the rock, a name repeated like a drumbeat through the song, perfect in action, all paths just, faithful, without deceit, the foundation, the fortress, the solid ground beneath everything. This God rescued a people from bondage, carried them like a parent carries a child, fed them in the wasteland. Then comes the turn. The people will grow fat. They will kick like a well-fed animal. They will abandon the rock who fathered them. They will worship foreign gods, new gods that their ancestors did not fear. They will forget the God who gave them birth. The language cuts with precision. Moses doesn't soften the prophecy with abstraction. He names the betrayal clearly. Prosperity will breed amnesia. Abundance will become a curse. The very blessings promised in the covenant will become the instrument of its breaking. God's response in the song matches the betrayal in intensity. They made me jealous with what is no God. So I will make them jealous with those who are no people. Fire will burn from divine anger. It will consume the earth and its increase. It will set ablaze the foundations of the mountains. Famine, plague, wild beasts, the sword in the streets. The curses from the treaty will fall like rain. But here the song does something unexpected. At the moment of maximum judgment, it pivots. God pulls back from complete destruction. Why? Because enemies would misunderstand. They would claim their own power achieved victory. They would not recognize divine judgment. So, for the sake of the divine name, for the sake of truth being known in the world, a remnant will survive. This is not mercy, as we usually understand it. This is something stranger and more complex. The survival of the people becomes necessary for cosmic justice to be comprehensible. Their continued existence, even in reduced and chastened form, serves as testimony. The song transforms disaster into witness. The poetry throughout employs ancient Semitic verse techniques. Parallelism, where the second line echoes and develops the first, creates a rolling, inevitable rhythm. The images pile upon each other. Rock, parent, eagle, vine, serpent, sword. Each metaphor opens a new angle on the relationship between God and people. The accumulation overwhelms the listener, not through argument, but through aesthetic force. The song also indulges in bitter irony. The people will sacrifice to demons, not to God, to new gods recently come. Their rock sold them. The rock who fathered them they forgot. The parallelism here emphasizes the cosmic joke. They traded the eternal rock for rubble, the faithful parent for absent newcomers. Moses weaves his own experience into the prophecy. He too will die outside the promised land, not for his own sin, but as part of the larger pattern. Leaders pay the price for communal failure. His death becomes the first fulfillment of the tragic arc he describes in song. The pattern begins even before the Jordan crossing. The song contains another hidden element. It predicts not just failure, but a specific kind of failure. The people will forsake God not in adversity, but in prosperity. Not when pressed by enemies, but when dwelling secure. This is the more subtle and deadly form of forgetting. Desperation drives people to prayer. Comfort drives them to complacency. This prophecy will haunt every generation that follows. When times are good, the song warns that this is precisely when danger grows. When the nation flourishes, leaders can open the scroll and read Moses' words. Describing exactly this moment as the prelude to disaster, the song becomes a permanent alarm system, sounding loudest when everything seems fine. The final verses shift tone again. They call nations to rejoice, for God will avenge the blood of his servants and cleanse the land, even in judgment, even in catastrophe. Purpose remains. The suffering will not be meaningless. The cleansing will not be final extinction. From the ashes, something can grow again. Moses commands the people to take all these words to heart, to teach them to children, because they are not empty words, but your very life. Through them you will prolong your days in the land you are crossing the Jordan to possess. The song itself becomes part of the covenant, a witness that cannot be destroyed, even if the nation falls. The timing of the song matters. Moses delivers it in chapter 32, after the covenant ceremony, after the blessings and curses, after laying out the complete vision of what life under treaty could be. He waits until they have heard the ideal before showing them the inevitable. Hope must precede tragedy, even though tragedy may prove unavoidable. Ancient Near Eastern literature contains nothing quite like this. Kings commissioned songs celebrating their triumphs, inscribing their victories for posterity. Moses composes a song predicting failure and embedding it in the national memory at the moment of foundation. This is anti-propaganda, truth-telling that undermines its own program. The song also functions as permission to speak hard truths. Future prophets will quote it, will echo its themes, will hold the nation accountable to its own founding documents. When Jeremiah stands in the temple courtyard declaring that God will destroy this place, he stands on the authority of Moses' song. The poem licenses protest, but the song carries emotional weight beyond its prophetic function. Moses is a father watching his children prepare to make choices he knows will break their lives. He cannot stop them. He can only give them words to carry, a melody that will haunt them, lyrics that will surface in memory when the disaster he foresaw finally arrives. The song also preserves a fierce tenderness. Even in passages describing divine anger, the language returns repeatedly to family metaphors. Parent and child, eagle teaching its young to fly. The anger comes from betrayed love, not from cosmic indifference. The judgment flows from relationship, not from abstract justice. Moses ends the song and tells the people to place these words on their hearts. Then he prepares to climb the mountain to die. The song becomes his final gift. Not comfort, not false hope, but the truth set to music, terrible and beautiful, a prophecy and a lament composed in a single voice. The melody will play on repeat through all the centuries to come, its refrain haunting every generation that thinks it has finally escaped the pattern Moses described. The death of Moses, the unresolved ending. Moses climbs alone. The tribes remain in the valley below, a sea of tents stretching toward the Jordan. They will cross without him. His legs still carry him steadily despite his 120 years. His eyes have not dimmed. His vigor has not faded. He ascends not from weakness, but from divine decree. Mount Nebo rises from the plains of Moab, its peak offering a panoramic view that spans the entire Promised Land. God told Moses to climb this mountain, to see what he could not enter, to die within sight of fulfillment. The cruelty of this seems almost unbearable. 40 years of leading a difficult people through an impossible wilderness. 40 years of interceding when God's patience wore thin. 40 years of teaching, judging, guiding, suffering. And the reward? A view from a distance. The text offers little explanation. Back at Meribah, Moses struck the rock instead of speaking to it. This failure to trust God fully before the people meant he could not lead them into Canaan. The punishment seems disproportionate to modern readers. One mistake after 4 decades of faithful service, and the door closes forever. But Deuteronomy suggests something deeper. Moses represents the generation that knew slavery. He carries Egypt in his bones, its trauma, its memory. The Promised Land requires a new kind of people, formed entirely in freedom, teaching themselves to build rather than merely to survive. Moses must remain outside for the same reason the entire Exodus generation had to perish in the wilderness. The past cannot construct the future, no matter how necessary it was for reaching this moment. From Nebo's summit, God shows Moses the full scope of the land, Gilead as far as Dan in the north, all of Naphtali, Ephraim and Manasseh, the territory of Judah extending to the western sea, the Negev desert, the whole valley from Jericho, the city of palms, as far as Zoar in the south. The supernatural quality of this vision becomes clear. No human eye could see such distances from a single peak. Moses views the land not through natural sight, but through prophetic revelation. God speaks, "This is the land I promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." The words acknowledge both the fulfillment and its withholding. The promise to the ancestors will be kept, just not through Moses. Then Moses dies there in Moab, just as God had said. The passive construction matters. The text doesn't say Moses simply ceased breathing. It says he died by the mouth of God, a phrase so intimate and strange that Jewish tradition interprets it to mean God kissed his soul from his body. Death comes as a divine intimacy, not as an enemy. God buries Moses in the valley in Moab, opposite Beth Peor. No one knows the location to this day. This detail transforms Moses into something unique. Every other significant biblical figure has a known tomb. Abraham rests in Machpelah. Rachel lies on the road to Bethlehem. David sleeps in Jerusalem. But Moses has no shrine, no pilgrimage site, no place where people can venerate his memory. The hidden grave serves multiple purposes. It prevents Moses from becoming an object of worship. It keeps the focus on the covenant rather than the mediator. It also preserves Moses in perpetual motion, never settled, never finished, always leading toward a destination that remains just beyond reach. The text records that Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eye was undimmed and his vigor unabated. He dies at full strength, not worn down by age, but removed while still capable. This reinforces that his death comes from divine plan, not natural decay. He could have continued, should have continued, but the narrative requires his absence. Joshua, son of Nun, receives the spirit of wisdom because Moses laid his hands on him. Leadership passes to the next generation with formal blessing and divine confirmation. But the transition contains a profound loss. The people mourn Moses for 30 days in the plains of Moab, following the traditional mourning period. But when it ends, the text makes a devastating statement. No prophet has arisen in the land like Moses, whom the divine knew face to face. This epitaph comes not centuries later, but immediately, in the same breath as his death. The loss is recognized instantly. Moses was not just another prophet. He spoke with God directly, without dreams or visions or intermediary forms. He performed signs and wonders in Egypt that no one has matched. He displayed mighty power and awesome deeds before all the land, and this unique figure now lies in an unmarked grave. The book ends with this absence. The ideal leader is gone. The promised land stretches visible but not yet entered. The covenant has been given but not yet tested in practice. Everything remains potential, nothing yet realized. This creates a permanent tension at the heart of the tradition. Other ancient texts would resolve this differently. They would describe Moses conquering the land, establishing the nation, dying peacefully in his palace, with grandchildren around him. They would give the founder a triumphant ending, showing the fruit of his labor. Deuteronomy refuses this comfort. The ending declares that the ideal will always exceed the real. Moses sees the land, but cannot enter it. Every subsequent leader will fall short of Moses. Every generation will live with the gap between what was commanded and what can be achieved. This unresolved ending also transforms how future readers approach the text. The book doesn't present a completed success story to be admired from a distance. It offers an ongoing project, unfinished, demanding participation. Each generation must cross its own Jordan, must attempt to build the society Moses described, must fail and try again. The death outside the land creates a space for hope. If Moses had entered and succeeded, the story would be finished. His failure to reach the goal means the goal still beckons. The land remains promised. The ideal remains possible. The covenant remains open. The ending refuses closure because the project refuses completion. Moses climbed the mountain alone and never came down. No disciples accompanied him to record final words. No crowd witnessed his passing. Just a solitary old man, a distant vista, and a God who buried him in secret. The people woke the next morning to face their future without him, carrying only his words, his laws, and his unfinished dream. The Josianic reforms, putting the book into action. The high priest Hilkiah enters the king's presence holding a scroll. The year is 622 BCE. King Josiah of Judah is 26 years old, 18 years into his reign. In the middle of extensive temple renovations, Hilkiah speaks carefully. "I have found the book of the law in the house of the divine." No one expected this discovery. Workers clearing debris from forgotten storerooms uncovered the scroll. How long it lay hidden remains unclear. Decades? Centuries? The text itself will suggest answers. Shaphan, the secretary, takes the scroll and reads it aloud before the king. We don't know how much he reads. Perhaps only excerpts. Perhaps the entire work. What matters is Josiah's response. When he hears the words, he tears his robes. The ancient gesture of grief and horror. Josiah grasps immediately what his court may have missed. The scroll contains not merely old laws, but a binding treaty with detailed curses for disobedience. He looks at the current state of Judah and sees those curses manifesting. The kingdom sits diminished, threatened by empires, its worship corrupted by multiple shrines and foreign gods. The found book functions as a mirror, showing the nation its own face. The king sends Hilkiah and other officials to consult Huldah, the prophetess. She lives in Jerusalem's second quarter. When they bring her the scroll's contents, she confirms Josiah's fears. The divine anger burns against this place, because the people have abandoned the covenant and burned incense to other gods. Disaster will come. But because Josiah's heart was responsive, because he tore his clothes when he heard the words, he will not see the coming catastrophe. He will die in peace. Josiah doesn't accept this personal exemption as sufficient. He summons every elder of Judah and Jerusalem. He goes up to the house of the divine with all the people, both small and great. There he reads in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant that had been found in the temple. Then the king stands by the pillar and renews the covenant before God, to follow the divine, to keep the commands and testimonies and statutes with all his heart and soul, to perform the words of the covenant written in this book. All the people pledge themselves to the covenant. What follows is the most comprehensive religious reform in Judah's history. Josiah systematically dismantles every structure that contradicts the scroll's central command. Worship only at the place the divine will choose. One God, one altar, one people. First, he purges the temple itself. Vessels made for Baal and Asherah and the starry hosts are carried out of the temple and burned in the fields near the Kidron Valley. The ashes are taken to Bethel. priests who burned incense at high places throughout Judah are removed. Those who burned incense to Baal, to sun and moon and constellations, are stopped. The Asherah pole, a wooden cult object representing a goddess, is removed from the temple, burned, ground to dust, and the dust scattered on the graves of common people. This particular detail stings. The goddess symbol venerated by many ends as powder on paupers' tombs. Utterly dishonored, Josiah tears down the quarters of the male shrine servants in the temple grounds, where women wove textiles for Asherah. He breaks down the high places throughout Judah where priests had burned incense. He extends his reforms even into the ruins of the northern kingdom, destroyed by Assyria a century earlier. At Bethel, where Jeroboam had erected a golden calf centuries before, Josiah demolishes the altar and high place. The text records a macabre detail. Josiah takes bones from nearby tombs, burns them on the altar at Bethel, and thus defiles it permanently. This fulfills a prophecy spoken 3 centuries earlier by an anonymous prophet. The long arc of judgment reaches completion. Even the dead serve the reform. But Josiah spares one tomb at Bethel, that of the prophet who had proclaimed the original prophecy, and a prophet from Samaria who lies beside him. Let no one disturb their bones, Josiah commands. Even in zealous reform, he honors prophetic witness. The scope of destruction is comprehensive. Josiah defiles Topheth in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so no one can use it to sacrifice children to Molech. He removes horses dedicated to the sun that previous kings had placed at the temple entrance. He destroys altars on rooftops and altars in the courtyards. Every high place, every sacred stone, every Asherah pole throughout the land falls before his campaign. The scroll Hilkiah found contains not only the law of centralization, but also the command to celebrate Passover. Josiah realizes that this feast commemorating the Exodus from Egypt has not been properly observed since the days of the judges. Centuries before, he orders its celebration according to the book's specifications. The Passover of Josiah's 18th year becomes legendary. The biblical text emphasizes that no Passover like it had been kept since the days when judges led the land, not through all the days of the kings of the northern and southern kingdoms. This is the Exodus remembered as never before. The founding story reclaimed and reenacted according to the covenant's precise terms. Josiah also removes mediums, spiritists, household gods, idols, and all detestable things seen in Judah and Jerusalem. He does this specifically to fulfill the words of the law written in the book that Hilkiah found. Every action ties directly back to the discovered scroll. The book provides both diagnosis and prescription, problem and solution. The biblical historian offers an extraordinary assessment. Neither before nor after Josiah was there a king like him, who turned to the divine with all his heart and soul and strength, in accordance with all the law of Moses. This epitaph consciously echoes the Shema itself: heart, soul, and strength. The central command of Deuteronomy. Josiah embodies the ideal the scroll describes. Yet Huldah's prophecy contains a dark shadow. Despite Josiah's unmatched devotion, divine anger still burns against Judah. Because of all the provocations of Manasseh, Josiah's grandfather had committed. The curses of the covenant will still fall. The disaster will come. Josiah's reforms buy time, but cannot reverse the verdict. This tragic note transforms the entire reform. Josiah acts with complete commitment, despite knowing it cannot ultimately succeed. He pursues faithfulness not because it guarantees survival, but because the covenant demands it. The reform becomes an act of integrity rather than pragmatism, obedience rather than manipulation. The historical context makes Josiah's actions even more remarkable. The Assyrian Empire that dominated the region for centuries is crumbling. Babylon and Egypt maneuver for advantage in the power vacuum. Small kingdoms like Judah face impossible choices about alliances and survival. In this context, Josiah chooses to center his policy not on military pragmatism, but on the demands of an ancient covenant. Archaeological evidence supports the biblical account of centralization. Multiple excavations show high places and local shrines throughout Judah falling out of use during this period. The historical Josiah pursued religious consolidation that matches the scroll's demands. The scroll itself raises questions never fully answered. Was it genuinely ancient, hidden away and forgotten? Or was it composed recently, perhaps by reform-minded priests, and strategically discovered to provide authority for changes they desired? Scholars debate endlessly. The text's language and theology match the 7th century BCE closely, yet it claims Mosaic authorship from centuries earlier. Perhaps both things are true. Ancient traditions preserved orally and in fragmentary written forms could have been compiled and edited into the Deuteronomic scroll during or shortly before Josiah's time. The discovery might have been the compilation's completion and public presentation. The book would be both genuinely ancient in content and newly formed in current written form. Regardless of composition history, the scroll's impact was immediate and profound. It provided a blueprint for comprehensive reform. It gave divine authority to political and religious changes. It created a standard by which the nation could measure itself. Most importantly, it demonstrated that an ancient text could still speak with urgency to contemporary crisis. Josiah dies tragically in 609 BCE, killed at Megiddo, trying to stop Egyptian forces from assisting the failing Assyrians against rising Babylon. He was 39 years old. The kingdom he reformed lasted barely 2 more decades before Babylon destroyed Jerusalem completely in 586 BCE. But the scroll survived. In exile, with the temple destroyed and the land lost, Deuteronomy explained why disaster came. It also provided hope. The curses were not arbitrary, but covenantal, and covenant can be renewed. The book Josiah implemented became the book that sustained those who outlived his kingdom. The Exilic Lens. Rereading after the fall. The year is 586 BCE. Nebuchadnezzar's armies have breached Jerusalem's walls after an 18-month siege. The temple burns. The royal palace crumbles. Soldiers round up survivors for the long march to Babylon. The kingdom of Judah ceases to exist. Among the possessions the exiles carry into captivity, one item matters more than any other: the scroll. Deuteronomy travels to Babylon not as historical curiosity, but as explanation, accusation, and hope. The scroll had warned them. Chapter 28's curses, read countless times during Josiah's reforms and after, now manifest with terrible precision. The divine will scatter you among all nations, from one end of the earth to the other. There you will worship other gods of wood and stone. Among those nations you will find no repose, no resting place. The divine will give you an anxious mind, eyes weary with longing, and a despairing heart. You will live in constant suspense, filled with dread both night and day, never sure of your life. Every phrase describes exile. The specificity becomes unbearable. The text predicted not merely punishment, but this exact punishment: displacement, anxiety, loss of homeland, service to foreign powers, perpetual uncertainty. The curses read like a description of life in Babylon, written centuries before Babylon conquered them. The exiles face a theological crisis. Ancient Near Eastern peoples understood divine power geographically. Each god ruled a territory. Defeat meant your god was weaker than the conqueror's god. When Babylon destroys Jerusalem, logic suggests Marduk has triumphed over the God of the land. The exiles should abandon their defeated deity and adopt Babylonian gods. Many probably did, but Deuteronomy offers a different interpretation. The disaster came not because their God was weak, but because the people broke the covenant. The scroll transforms catastrophe from evidence of divine impotence into evidence of divine consistency. God keeps promises, both the blessings for obedience and the curses for rebellion. This reframing makes suffering comprehensible within the covenant framework, rather than contradicting it. The book's structure of blessings and curses provides exiles with a roadmap. They are not lost in chaos. They are living in chapter 28, experiencing the predicted consequences of covenant violation. This terrible knowledge brings a strange comfort. If the curses came true, exactly as written, perhaps the promises of restoration will also materialize exactly as written. Chapter 30 becomes crucial for exiles. After describing the most devastating curses, Moses speaks of restoration. When all these blessings and curses I have set before you come upon you, and you take them to heart wherever the divine your God disperses you among the nations, and when you and your children return to the divine your God, and obey him with all your heart and with all your soul, according to everything I command you today, then the divine your God will restore your fortunes, and have compassion on you, and gather you again from all the nations where he scattered you. This promise addresses exile specifically. The text imagines scattering among nations, then describes return. For people sitting in Babylon, these words speak directly to their situation. The covenant contains not only curse, but mechanism for reversal. Return requires repentance, taking the words to heart, turning back to God with complete devotion. But return remains possible. The exilic community begins intensive engagement with the text. Without temple, without land, without king, the words themselves become the place where God can be encountered. Study replaces sacrifice. Textual interpretation becomes the primary religious act. Groups gather to read the scroll. They discuss what it means. They try to apply these laws to their new reality. How do agricultural laws work when you have no land to farm? How do pilgrimage festivals function without a temple to visit? The exiles must reinterpret everything for life in diaspora. They need to extract principles that go beyond geography. This intense focus on text plants the seeds for what will become Rabbinic Judaism. The synagogue emerges during this exile. It's a meeting place for reading and studying Torah, not for offering sacrifices. Prayer starts replacing burnt offerings. Learning becomes a form of worship. These adaptations allow Jewish identity to survive without the very things Deuteronomy seemed to require. A land, a temple, a centralized cult. Deuteronomy's emphasis on teaching becomes crucial now. The command to teach these words to your children. When you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Now it means preservation of identity in a foreign culture. Without constant education, the next generation might assimilate completely. The generation born in Babylon might forget who they are. The law must be written on more than door frames and gates. It must be written on hearts and minds. The scroll also provides ethical guidance for how to live under foreign rule. Its laws protecting foreigners take on new meaning. Since you were foreigners in Egypt, the exiles are now foreigners in Babylon. The command to seek the peace of the city where you're sent. This comes from the prophet Jeremiah. It echoes Deuteronomy's insistence on treating vulnerable populations properly. Exile teaches empathy through experience. Later editors likely add certain passages during or after exile. the section predicting Israel will demand a king like the nations, the subsequent limitations on royal power. This reads like commentary, written after monarchy failed. The warnings about accumulating horses, wives, and gold, precisely Solomon's sins that split the kingdom. These seem composed with hindsight, but this editorial work doesn't corrupt an original text. Ancient texts were living documents, updated and expanded as communities found new meanings in them. The exilic editions deepen the scroll's message. They don't distort it. They make explicit what was always implicit. The law judges even its own institutions. Kings, priests, prophets, all stand under covenant authority. The question of Moses' authorship becomes less important in exile. What matters is the text's authority and truth. Whether Moses wrote every word centuries ago matters less. Whether scribes compiled and edited traditions matters less. What matters is whether the scroll accurately describes covenant relationship, whether it explains current suffering, whether it offers hope for restoration. Deuteronomy's insistence on the unity of God takes on new significance. In polytheistic Babylon, this matters deeply, surrounded by temples to many gods, by processions honoring Marduk and Ishtar. The exiles cling to the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the divine, our God, the divine, is one. This declaration becomes resistance, identity, defiance. It marks Jewish distinctiveness. It preserves monotheistic faith against overwhelming cultural pressure. The book's vision of a just society provides critique of Babylonian power. Deuteronomy's laws protecting the poor, limiting debt, providing for widows and orphans. These stand in sharp contrast to imperial systems built on exploitation, built on slavery. The exiles carry not merely ethnic identity, they carry an alternative social vision, a memory of how society could be organized around different values. Some exiles give up hope. They settle permanently in Babylon, pursuing success within the empire, letting distinctive identity fade. But others read Deuteronomy as promise and obligation. They maintain separation, preserve traditions, teach children, and await return. The scroll sustains them through decades of displacement. When Cyrus of Persia conquers Babylon in 539 BCE, things change. He allows exiled peoples to return to their homelands. A community chooses to make the difficult journey back to Judah. They carry the scroll with them. Deuteronomy explained their exile. Now it guides their restoration. The returning exiles face a shattered land. Jerusalem lies in ruins. The temple site stands empty. Those who remained during exile have intermarried. They've adopted mixed religious practices. The returnees must rebuild more than physical structures. They must rebuild covenant identity. Deuteronomy provides the blueprint. The emphasis on purity of worship, on centralized cult, on teaching the law, on maintaining boundaries with other peoples. These principles shape the restoration community. The book that was found in Josiah's temple, lost in Babylon's conquest, now becomes the constitution for rebuilt Judah. But exile changed how the book is read. Before exile, it was a program for national success. After exile, it's a framework for covenant faithfulness. Faithfulness regardless of circumstances. The promise of land remains important, but identity no longer depends on political sovereignty. The law can be kept in any location. God can be worshipped without a temple. The covenant transcends geography. This shift allows Judaism to survive repeated disasters that follow: Greek occupation, Roman conquest, temple destruction in 60 CE, dispersion throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Each catastrophe might have ended the religion. Instead, the pattern established during Babylonian exile repeats. The community gathers around the text, reinterprets the law for new circumstances, and survives. Deuteronomy's unresolved ending takes on prophetic meaning. Moses dying before entering the land. Every generation lives in the gap between promise and fulfillment, between what is commanded and what can be achieved. Exile makes this perpetual tension explicit. The book becomes less a manual for possessed land, more a guide for persistent hope despite displacement. In the centuries after exile, something unprecedented happens. A religion transforms from a temple cult into an educational system. Sacrifice becomes secondary to study. Priests share influence with teachers. The scroll moves from the temple's holy place into every home and community gathering. Deuteronomy makes this transformation possible because it is at its core a teaching text. The command appears repeatedly. Teach these words to your children. Discuss them when you sit at home and walk along the road. When you lie down and get up, write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates. This is not merely preservation of information. This is the creation of a culture defined by constant engagement with law and covenant. Every daily activity becomes opportunity for education. Every doorway prompts memory. Every gathering requires discussion of the text. The book itself models how teaching should function. Moses doesn't simply proclaim laws. He explains their purpose. He provides historical context. He appeals to memory of slavery in Egypt as motivation for treating others justly. He paints vivid pictures of consequences for both obedience and rebellion. This is pedagogy, not just proclamation. The Shema becomes the cornerstone of Jewish education. Children learn these words before any others. Hear, O Israel, the divine our God, the divine is one. Love the divine your God with all your heart, soul, and strength. These commands I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and walk along the road, when you lie down and get up. Notice the progression. First, the command is placed on the adult's heart. Then, only then, it can be impressed on children. You cannot teach what you do not embody. The parent or teacher must first internalize the covenant before transmitting it to the next generation. The command to discuss the law constantly creates something special, a conversational rather than merely memorized tradition. Children are encouraged to ask questions. The Passover ritual explicitly includes questions from children about why this night differs from all others. Asking becomes a religious virtue. Understanding, not just obedience, is the goal. This educational emphasis produces a literate culture, unusual for the ancient world. Reading and writing become religious obligations, not elite privileges. Texts must be read publicly every 7 years. During the Feast of Tabernacles, this means enough literacy in the population to both read and comprehend. Over time, this develops into a comprehensive educational system. Communities establish schools where boys learn to read, using Deuteronomy and other Torah texts. The Bet Sefer, House of the Book, becomes a standard institution. Later sources describe schools in every Jewish town, funded by the community, free for all male children. The teaching extends beyond children to adults. The regular public reading of Torah in synagogues creates ongoing adult education. Every Sabbath, a portion is read and discussed. Over the course of a year or 3 years, depending on local custom, the entire Torah is covered. This means constant review, deepening understanding with each cycle. Deuteronomy's legal sections become the basis for detailed oral interpretation. How exactly do you love God with all your heart, soul, and strength? What qualifies as work prohibited on the Sabbath? How do you treat a foreign resident in practical daily interactions? Teachers develop elaborate systems: interpretation, discussion, and application. This oral tradition eventually becomes so extensive it requires written codification. The Mishnah, completed around 200 CE, organizes these interpretations into systematic categories. The Talmud adds further layers of discussion, debate, and case law. But the foundation remains Deuteronomy's laws and principles. The emphasis on education creates a portable religion. Christians can worship anywhere a church building stands. Muslims can pray anywhere that faces Mecca. But Jewish identity becomes inseparable from the act of studying text. Where 10 Jewish males gather to read and discuss Torah, there is a community, no temple required, no land necessary. This portability proves crucial for survival. When Romans destroy the Second Temple in 70 CE, the loss is devastating, but not fatal. The real center of Jewish life is not the building, it's the book. Teachers like Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai escape Jerusalem's siege. Establish schools that preserve the tradition. The law continues even when the land is lost again. Deuteronomy's structure, as Moses' teaching to a new generation, provides a model for this ongoing education. Every generation stands in the position of those tribes on the plains of Moab, hearing the covenant explained again. The law is not merely inherited. It's actively received, studied, questioned, and applied. The text includes subtle pedagogical techniques. Repetition reinforces key concepts. Narrative sections alternate with legal ones, preventing monotony. Motivational appeals alternate with practical commands. The variety of rhetorical approaches keeps listeners engaged. Across the lengthy text, Deuteronomy also establishes the principle that law must be taught in accessible language. Moses delivers these words in clear terms, explains their reasoning, ensures understanding. This contrasts with priestly texts that can be more technical and obscure. Teaching requires clarity. The command to write the law on doorposts creates what later becomes mezuzah, a small case containing parchment, inscribed with passages from Deuteronomy, attached to door frames. Every time someone enters or exits, they see it, perhaps touch it. Remember the covenant. Architecture becomes curriculum. Similarly, tefillin, small boxes containing Torah passages worn during prayer. These emerge from Deuteronomy's command to bind the words on your hand and forehead. The body itself becomes a teaching tool, a reminder system, a way of incorporating law into physical existence. These practices embed learning into the rhythm of daily life. You don't go to a separate place at a separate time to engage religion. You encounter it entering your home, in your morning routine, in conversations, at meals. The constant contact creates internalization. The law shapes thought patterns, not just behavior. The educational model also creates social cohesion. Across geographical separation, Jews scattered throughout the Roman Empire, Persia, Arabia, North Africa, all study the same texts, follow the same calendar, observe the same laws. Despite vast distances and lack of central political authority, shared education in Deuteronomy's law creates unified identity. This model influences other religions. Early Christians adapt the synagogue structure and Torah reading for their assemblies. The concept of Scripture as the center of community life spreads from Jewish practice. The emphasis on literacy and education becomes a religious value. In Christianity and later Islam, partly through Jewish influence, but within Judaism, the educational model creates distinctive characteristics. Debate becomes a virtue. Multiple interpretations can coexist. The Talmud preserves minority opinions alongside majority rulings. Questions are valued alongside answers. This intellectual pluralism emerges from Deuteronomy's command to teach, which implies discussion, examination, and understanding, rather than mere rote acceptance. The teacher gains status comparable to the priest. One who instructs in Torah deserves honor and support. Communities fund scholars, supporting their study. This creates a class of professional interpreters. But interpretation itself remains accessible to any educated person. Authority comes from knowledge of text, not from hereditary position. Deuteronomy's vision becomes reality. A nation where even the king must study law daily, where judges must know statutes thoroughly, where parents teach children constantly. This becomes reality in the culture that develops from it. Law and learning become inseparable from identity itself. The transformation from temple religion to text-centered tradition allows survival through circumstances that destroyed other ancient peoples. Assyrians, Babylonians, Hittites, Canaanites all disappear into history when their political structures collapse. Jewish identity persists. Through repeated conquests, multiple exiles, 2 millennia without homeland, because the tradition lives in the studied text, rather than in controlled territory. Deuteronomy provides the instruction manual for this survival. Its emphasis on constant teaching, on internalization, on passing tradition across generations. This creates a culture that can reconstitute itself. Anywhere people gather to read and discuss the law, the scroll becomes homeland. The study house becomes temple. The teacher becomes priest. And the covenant continues through change and catastrophe. Because education makes it portable, durable, and reproducible. In every generation, the Spirit drives Jesus into the wilderness. Immediately after his baptism, 40 days, 40 nights, he fasts. He faces the accuser, and in this moment of spiritual combat, Jesus reaches for a specific weapon, Deuteronomy. The parallel to Moses is deliberate. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness with Israel. Jesus spends 40 days. Moses fasted 40 days on Sinai, receiving the law. Jesus fasts 40 days before defending the law. The wilderness becomes the testing ground, where covenant identity is forged and proven. The tempter approaches after the long fast. When Jesus is weakest physically, the first temptation targets basic need. If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. The challenge is subtle. Use your power for yourself. Meet your own needs. You are hungry. You have authority. What's the harm? Jesus responds not with his own words, but with Scripture. It is written, "Man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." This comes directly from Deuteronomy chapter 8, where Moses reminds Israel why God let them hunger in the wilderness. To teach them dependence on divine provision. Manna trained the people to trust God's word above physical need. By quoting this passage, Jesus identifies with Israel's wilderness experience. He faces temptation the same way they did. He chooses reliance on God's word over immediate satisfaction. But where Israel repeatedly failed, demanding meat and grumbling against manna, Jesus succeeds. He embodies the faithful response Israel was called to, but could not sustain. The second temptation occurs at the temple's highest point. The accuser quotes Scripture himself, Psalm 91's promise that angels will guard God's faithful ones. Jump, he suggests. Force God to rescue you. Prove your special status. Jesus counters again with Deuteronomy. It is written, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test." This references Deuteronomy chapter 6. the passage immediately following the Shema. Moses warns Israel not to test God as they did at Massah, where the people demanded water and questioned whether God remained with them. The principle cuts to the heart of faith. Trust does not demand proof. Covenant relationship requires vulnerability, not certainty. To force God's hand through spectacular demonstration would violate faith's essential nature. Jesus refuses to manipulate providence, to turn relationship into transaction. The third temptation reveals the adversary's ultimate offer, from a high mountain showing all earth's kingdoms and their glory. The tempter proposes a deal. Worship me, and all this becomes yours. Dominion without suffering, authority without sacrifice, a shortcut to ruling the nations. Jesus' response is immediate and absolute. Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God, and serve him only. This comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6 again. Verses immediately after the Shema. The command for exclusive worship stands at the center of the covenant. No compromise is possible. No exception exists. Each temptation targets a different dimension of messianic expectation. The first offers physical power, control over material creation. The second offers religious spectacle, dramatic proof of divine favor. The third offers political dominion, authority over kingdoms. Jesus refuses all three, defining messiahship through Deuteronomy's priorities: reliance on God's word, trust without testing, and exclusive worship. The specific citations matter. Jesus doesn't quote from anywhere in Scripture. He draws all three responses from Deuteronomy chapters 6 and 8. Passages about Israel's wilderness testing, about the Shema's command to love God exclusively, about remembering dependence on divine provision. These are not random selections, but strategic choices from the heart of covenant theology. The pattern also reveals Jesus' methodology. When faced with temptation, he responds with Scripture. Rather than personal authority, he doesn't say, I refuse, or my Father would not want this. He says it is written. The text becomes the standard against which all options are measured. This approach models how Jesus will teach throughout his ministry. He repeatedly grounds arguments in Torah. When asked about greatest commandments, he quotes Deuteronomy's Shema first. When discussing divorce, he appeals to creation narratives, but also engages Deuteronomy's divorce regulations. When debating resurrection, he uses Torah to counter Sadducees. The law provides his theological framework. The wilderness temptation also establishes Jesus as the prophet like Moses, the one Deuteronomy promised. Moses mediated the covenant at Sinai. Jesus embodies the covenant in the wilderness. Moses gave the law. Jesus interprets and fulfills it. The promise in Deuteronomy 18, that God would raise up a prophet like Moses from among the people, this finds its answer in this Torah-quoting teacher from Nazareth. The temptation narrative connects to Jesus' larger mission. Israel failed in the wilderness, breaking covenant repeatedly despite divine provision. Jesus succeeds where Israel failed, maintaining perfect covenant faithfulness. He becomes the faithful Israelite, the true son who can lead a renewed people into renewed relationship with God. The Gospel writers intend this parallel. Matthew structures the Gospel with 5 major teaching sections, echoing the 5 books of Moses. Luke emphasizes Jesus' journey toward Jerusalem, like Moses' journey toward the Promised Land. John presents Jesus as the Word made flesh, the living Torah. The wilderness victory also prepares Jesus for future trials. Gethsemane will present another temptation to avoid suffering. The cross will raise the question of whether God has abandoned him. These later crises mirror the wilderness choices. Will he trust God's will or demand immediate rescue? Will he maintain exclusive devotion or grasp at shortcuts? The Deuteronomy citations create a theological foundation. If man lives by every word from God's mouth, then Jesus as the Word embodies ultimate life. If God alone deserves worship, then Jesus' divinity must be understood within strict monotheism. If testing God is forbidden, then faith requires vulnerability even unto death. Early Christian preaching draws heavily on this encounter. Jesus succeeds where Adam failed, where Israel failed, where every human fails. He becomes the second Adam, the true Israel, the faithful human who can restore the covenant relationship, the relationship sin destroyed. His weapon in this restoration? The same law that Israel received and repeatedly broke. The temptation also reveals Satan's methodology. He doesn't appear as obviously evil. He quotes Scripture. He makes reasonable proposals. He offers legitimate goods through illegitimate means. The danger comes not from rejecting God, but from serving God in wrong ways, from pursuing right goals through wrong methods. Jesus' counter-strategy provides the defense. Scripture must be read whole, not selectively. Texts cannot be torn from context to justify anything. The Shema's call for exclusive worship governs everything. How all other promises and commands are understood? Isolated verses must serve the covenant's overall purpose. The scene also addresses power. How will the Messiah use authority? The temptations offer three models: material power, religious spectacle, political dominance. Jesus rejects all three in favor of a different path, one shaped by Deuteronomy's vision. A covenant people serving God alone, trusting divine provision, refusing to manipulate the sacred. This shapes his entire ministry. He feeds multitudes, but refuses to be made king. He performs healings, but often commands silence about them. He speaks of God's kingdom, but rejects revolutionary violence. The wilderness decisions create the template for every subsequent choice. The Gospel accounts place this temptation immediately after Jesus' baptism, where a voice declared him beloved Son. The wilderness tests that identity. What kind of son will he be? One who exploits privilege or one who embraces mission? The Deuteronomy citations answer: a son who lives by divine word, trusts without testing, and worships exclusively. Later, when Jesus teaches his disciples to pray, he includes the petition, "Lead us not into temptation." He knows from experience how fierce that testing can be. He also knows the resource for resistance. Scripture properly understood, covenant properly honored, God properly worshipped. The 40 days in the wilderness become paradigmatic. They establish Jesus as the faithful covenant keeper. They demonstrate how to face spiritual assault. They show Scripture's power when rightly wielded. And they reveal that the promised prophet, like Moses, has arrived, armed not with a staff to strike rocks, but with the law itself, written on his heart, spoken from his lips, embodied in his life. Jeremiah stands in the temple courtyard with a message no one wants to hear. The year approaches 605 BCE. King Jehoiakim reigns in Judah. The nation has returned to old patterns. Josiah briefly interrupted them. High places operate again. The Deuteronomy scroll, so dramatic when discovered, has been forgotten by a new generation. Jeremiah's words cut through comfortable assumptions. This is what the divine says: if you do not obey me and follow my law, which I set before you, and if you do not listen to the words of my servants the prophets, whom I have sent to you again and again, then I will make this house like Shiloh, and this city a curse among all nations of earth. The reference to Shiloh shocks his audience. Shiloh hosted the tabernacle for generations, before Solomon built the temple. Then God abandoned it, allowing its destruction. Jeremiah says the same fate awaits Jerusalem. The temple provides no magical protection. Covenant faithfulness matters, not mere possession of sacred space. Jeremiah draws directly from Deuteronomy's warnings. The covenant spells out consequences. Blessings follow obedience. Curses follow rebellion. Jerusalem's destruction is not divine caprice, but covenant fulfillment. The treaty terms are being executed. He names specific violations. The people have built high places in the valley of Ben Hinnom to sacrifice sons and daughters, a practice Deuteronomy explicitly prohibits. They have placed detestable idols in the temple, defiling the house designated for divine name. They trust in deceptive words. The temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, as though the building's presence guarantees safety. Regardless of behavior, Jeremiah's critique focuses on leadership. He calls them shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep. Leaders are covenant guardians. Kings should write their own copy of the law and read it daily. Priests should teach the law faithfully. Prophets should call the people back to covenant terms. Instead, Judah's leaders lead people away from the covenant, into practices that guarantee disaster. This theme runs through multiple prophets. Isaiah, generations before Jeremiah, condemned empty religious observance, while injustice flourishes. Your new moons and appointed feasts my soul hates. He quotes God saying, "They have become a burden. Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make yourselves clean. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed." This is pure Deuteronomy. The law insists on linking worship with ethics. You cannot sacrifice properly while oppressing the poor. The tithe system exists to support widows and orphans. Debt forgiveness every 7 years prevents permanent poverty. Equal justice must be available to citizen and foreigner alike. Worship and social justice are inseparable in the covenant framework. Amos, writing in the northern kingdom before its destruction, proclaims similar themes. God hates festival assemblies when justice is absent. Religious observance without covenant faithfulness is worse than useless. It's offensive. Let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. This echoes Deuteronomy's sustained concern for the vulnerable and marginalized. Hosea uses marriage metaphor to describe covenant relationship. Israel plays the prostitute, running after other gods. The imagery is harsh, the language brutal, yet the core issue remains Deuteronomy's first demand: exclusive worship. The Shema commands loving God alone. Hosea describes national unfaithfulness as adultery, spiritual betrayal of the most intimate relationship. Micah summarizes prophetic theology concisely. He has shown you, mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. This distills Deuteronomy into 3 principles: justice, protecting the vulnerable, ensuring fair treatment; mercy, forgiving debts, showing compassion; humility, recognizing dependence on divine grace, rather than trusting human power. The prophets function as Deuteronomy promised. Moses predicted God would raise up prophets like him to speak divine words. Their role is to hold the nation accountable when other institutions fail. Kings accumulate power and wealth in violation of the law. Priests corrupt worship and neglect teaching. Judges take bribes. When the entire system breaks down, prophets emerge to call people back to covenant foundations. They are rarely popular. Jeremiah is beaten, imprisoned, thrown into a cistern, accused of treason. Speaking truth to power carries risk, but the prophetic role requires this courage. Someone must say what others will not. must-name violations everyone prefers to ignore. The prophets also interpret history through covenant lens. Northern Kingdom falls to Assyria in 722 BCE. Covenant violation explains it. Jerusalem will fall to Babylon. Same cause. The treaty curses are not mysterious or arbitrary. They describe natural consequences of social collapse. That follows abandoning justice and exclusive worship. But prophets offer more than judgment. They hold out hope for restoration. Jeremiah purchases a field during Jerusalem's siege, an act of faith that land will again have value, that people will return, that covenant can be renewed. He prophesies a new covenant, written not on stone but on hearts, where people will know God directly, without need for teaching. This new covenant language doesn't abandon Deuteronomy. It extends the logic. Deuteronomy commands placing the law on hearts, teaching it constantly, internalizing its principles. Jeremiah envisions this internalization becoming complete. The law and the will would align perfectly. Obedience would flow from nature, rather than from external command. Ezekiel, prophesying among exiles in Babylon, describes a similar vision. God will give a new heart and a new spirit. The heart of stone becomes a heart of flesh. God's Spirit within causes people to follow divine statutes. Again, this builds on Deuteronomy's call for circumcised hearts, for internal transformation enabling covenant faithfulness. These prophetic visions influence how later generations read Deuteronomy. The law is not merely external code, but invitation to transformation. The goal is not legalistic compliance, but genuine love of God expressed through concrete actions, actions of justice and mercy. The prophets also universalize Deuteronomy's vision. While the law focuses on Israel's covenant, prophets see nations beyond Israel also accountable to divine justice. Amos pronounces judgment on surrounding nations for war crimes and atrocities. Justice is not merely Israel's covenant obligation, but universal principle. God cares how all nations treat the vulnerable. This creates tension with Deuteronomy's command to destroy certain Canaanite groups. Prophets like Jonah resist exclusive focus on Israel. When God shows mercy to repentant Nineveh, capital of cruel Assyria, Jonah protests, but God insists on caring for those 120,000 people. The prophetic trajectory moves toward inclusive concern, while maintaining Israel's special covenant role. The prophetic books preserve minority voices. Not all prophets speak truth. Jeremiah contends with false prophets, who promise peace when destruction approaches, who tailor messages to please rulers and populace. The test Deuteronomy provides is clear. Do their predictions come true? Do they call people back to covenant? True prophets risk everything to deliver hard messages. They live the tension Moses established, seeing both the ideal and the inevitable failure, yet speaking anyway. They embody the prophet like Moses' role, standing outside corrupted institutions, to call the nation back to its founding covenant. The prophetic literature also develops theology beyond Deuteronomy's framework. Questions of individual versus collective responsibility, of suffering's meaning, of life after death. These emerge through prophetic reflection on exile and return, but the foundation remains Deuteronomic. Covenant creates the relationship. Torah provides the terms. Justice and exclusive worship form the core obligations. When Jesus appears, he stands firmly in this prophetic tradition. He quotes prophets constantly, especially Isaiah. He cleanses the temple while citing Jeremiah's warning. He pronounces woes on religious leaders who neglect justice and mercy, while maintaining meticulous ritual observance. He claims prophetic authority to interpret law. and call people to authentic covenant faithfulness. The prophets demonstrate that Deuteronomy is not a closed book, but a living tradition, requiring constant reapplication. Each generation faces new challenges, demanding fresh interpretation of ancient covenant principles. The prophets model this interpretive work, showing how timeless law speaks to specific circumstances, how eternal principles judge contemporary practices. They also reveal that institutions always tend toward corruption, even covenant structures. Monarchy, priesthood, temple. These can become mechanisms of injustice. The prophetic voice must remain independent, speaking from outside the system, accountable only to covenant truth, regardless of personal cost. This prophetic function never ends. Every generation needs voices, calling powerful institutions back to founding principles, exposing gaps between stated ideals and actual practice, demanding justice for those whom systems marginalize. The prophets, like Moses, keep appearing, keep speaking, keep disturbing comfortable religion with covenant demands. In 1630, John Winthrop stands on the deck of the Arbella, approaching Massachusetts Bay. He delivers a sermon to the Puritan colonists, a sermon that will echo through American history. The title is A Model of Christian Charity. The key phrase is, "We shall be as a city upon a hill." This language comes directly from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, but the framework comes from Deuteronomy. Winthrop describes the colonists as entering covenant with God to establish a godly commonwealth in the New World. If they fail, he warns, they will become a byword among the nations. The blessing and curse formula transplanted to American shores. The Puritans saw themselves as New Israel. England was their Egypt, a place of religious oppression from which they fled. The Atlantic was their Red Sea. Massachusetts Bay became their promised land. This was not metaphor, but theological conviction. They believed God called them to create covenant communities, showing the world how biblical principles could govern society. This interpretation shaped colonial development. Massachusetts Bay Colony established laws drawn directly from biblical texts, including Deuteronomy. The legal code addressed everything, from worship to economic relationships to treatment of strangers. The goal was to build a society reflecting covenant ideals. The influence extended beyond Puritans. American founders, though rarely evangelical Christians, absorbed biblical political concepts through cultural osmosis. The Bible they knew best was the King James Version, heavy with covenantal language. Deuteronomy's vision of law governing both rulers and ruled, of society organized around higher principles, of power limited by moral framework. These ideas permeated political thinking. The Declaration of Independence echoes covenant structure. It begins with principles. All men created equal, endowed by their Creator with rights. It recounts historical grievances against King George. It declares independence based on those principles and grievances. This mirrors Deuteronomy's pattern. Establish principle, recount history, declare terms. The Constitution's preamble, we the people, places sovereignty in the collective. Rather than a monarch, Deuteronomy did this first. The covenant binds the entire people, not just their leaders. Kings rule under law, not above it. This radical idea, that power flows from governed to government. That law constrains rulers. This has roots in biblical covenant theology. The system of checks and balances reflects Deuteronomy's institutional diversity. Moses establishes multiple centers of authority: judges, priests, prophets, and eventually kings. No single office holds complete power. Each checks the others. American founders created executive, legislative, and judicial branches for similar reasons. Concentration of power inevitably corrupts. Dispersed authority provides accountability. Deuteronomy requires the king to write his own copy of the law and read it daily. The Constitution requires presidents to swear an oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Both place even the highest office under documentary authority. The ruler serves the law, not vice versa. The concept of written constitution comes partly from covenant tradition. Ancient treaties were written, displayed publicly, read regularly. Deuteronomy commands writing the law on large stones. When entering the land, reading it aloud every 7 years. Teaching it constantly. Americans created a written constitution, displayed in the National Archives, read in schools, appealed to in courts. The document provides stability and reference point across generations. Religious liberty in the First Amendment has complex roots, but Deuteronomy's insistence that faith cannot be coerced contributes. The covenant must be chosen freely. Moses places life and death, blessing and curse before the people, and commands them to choose. Forced faith is not faith. This principle, filtered through Enlightenment thought, helped justify religious freedom. The American emphasis on education also echoes Deuteronomic values. Public schools, literacy campaigns, land-grant universities all reflect the conviction that democracy requires educated citizens. Deuteronomy commanded constant teaching of law to children. Americans built a nation assuming widespread education was necessary. For self-government, the treatment of the poor and vulnerable shows mixed success. Deuteronomy demands special protection for widows, orphans, and foreigners. American history includes genuine attempts at social safety nets, poor laws, Social Security, welfare programs, but also spectacular failures to protect vulnerable populations. Slavery directly contradicted Deuteronomy's Exodus memory. You were slaves in Egypt, therefore treat others justly. American slavery violated this principle. While practitioners quoted other biblical texts to justify it, the tension between Deuteronomy's particular covenant with Israel and America's role as multi-religious democracy. This created ongoing struggles. Was America a Christian nation called to specific divine mission, or was it a secular republic with religiously diverse citizens? The question has never been fully resolved. Both views find historical support in founding documents and early practice. The concept of manifest destiny, God ordaining American expansion, distorted things. Distorted Deuteronomy's promise of land, where Moses receives specific boundaries for Israel's territory. American expansionists claimed divine blessing for continental conquest. This led to indigenous genocide, justified through warped biblical interpretation. The Promised Land became blank check for unlimited acquisition. Yet American self-critique also draws from biblical prophetic tradition. Abolitionists quoted Deuteronomy's command that escaped slaves not be returned to masters. Civil rights leaders appealed to biblical justice demands. The prophetic voice calling powerful to account, exposing gaps between ideals and reality. This remains alive in American discourse. Lincoln's second inaugural address sounds almost like a prophet, reading Deuteronomy's curses. The Civil War becomes divine judgment on slavery. Both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God. The Almighty has His own purposes. If God wills the war to continue until every drop of blood drawn by the lash shall be paid by another drawn by the sword, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. This reflects Deuteronomy's insistence that covenant violation brings disaster. Lincoln interprets national catastrophe through covenant lens. seeing slavery's curse falling on the whole nation. The war becomes cleansing judgment, terrible, but necessary. The American experiment tests whether Deuteronomy's vision can scale beyond ancient tribal society. Can covenant principles govern a vast, diverse, modern nation? Can written law restrain power without theocratic enforcement? Can education sustain civic identity across cultural differences? Can justice extend to all, not just covenant members? The results are mixed. American democracy has survived longer than most. Constitutional law has generally constrained executive power. Though with notable exceptions, education has been widespread, though unequal. Justice has expanded gradually to include groups initially excluded, though full equality remains aspirational. The founding document's language about equality and rights has created tools for reform. When reality contradicts stated principles, reformers can appeal to those principles. Frederick Douglass used the Constitution's preamble against slavery. Martin Luther King quoted the Declaration's self-evident truths. The gap between ideal and practice generates creative tension driving change. This mirrors Deuteronomy's unresolved ending. Moses dies before entering the land. The ideal remains ahead, beckoning but not yet achieved. This creates permanent dissatisfaction with status quo, constant push toward better approximation of stated goals. Covenant demands perpetual striving. American civil religion combines biblical covenant ideas with Enlightenment rationalism. God becomes providence, distant and universal. Covenant becomes constitution, rationally designed rather than divinely given. Yet the structure remains. A people pledged to common principles, organizing society under law, expecting prosperity through faithfulness, fearing decline through corruption. The American relationship to Deuteronomy is thus both derivative and distorted. The bones are there: written law, limited power, covenantal structure, prophetic critique, but crucial elements are missing or transformed. The object of ultimate loyalty shifts from God to nation. Economic justice gets subordinated to individual liberty. The particular becomes universal in problematic ways. Yet the influence remains undeniable. When Americans debate what their nation should be, they often invoke founding principles, appeal to documentary authority, claim higher law constrains present practice. These habits of thought come ultimately from covenant tradition. Deuteronomy taught the West that societies can be organized around ideals, that law can govern governors, that written principles can transcend generations. America represents one extended experiment. In living those convictions, however imperfectly, stand again with Moses on Mount Nebo. Behind him, 40 years of wilderness. Before him, a promised land he will never enter. In his hand, a scroll containing laws for a nation not yet formed. Why does this 3,000-year-old text still matter? Because it invented the concept that would shape the Western world: the rule of law. Before Deuteronomy, ancient Near Eastern kings were law. The king's word defined justice. No higher standard constrained royal power. Hammurabi's famous code was not constitutional limit, but royal demonstration, showing the king's wisdom, not constraining his authority. Deuteronomy places the king under the law. He must write his own copy and read it daily. He serves the covenant, not himself. This inversion of power relations plants seeds that grow into Western constitutionalism. The book also invents the welfare state, not as modern bureaucracy, but as principle. Society has obligation to the vulnerable. The tithe supports widows and orphans. Debt is forgiven regularly. Fields must be left accessible to the poor. Foreigners receive legal protection. Economic arrangements serve social cohesion, not just wealth creation. These commands were radical. Ancient economies operated on extraction and exploitation. The powerful took from the weak. That was simply how things worked. Deuteronomy says no. The covenant requires protecting those whom market forces would crush. Justice must be economic, or it is not justice. Modern welfare systems, however imperfect, descend from this principle. When societies debate social safety nets, they argue over Deuteronomy's vision. Does community have responsibility for its vulnerable members? The book answered yes 3 millennia ago. Education as cultural foundation also begins here. Teach these words to your children constantly. Discuss them sitting, walking, lying down, rising. Make them part of daily life. This creates a society organized around learning, text and interpretation. The printing press, universal public education, libraries, universities, all build on the foundation that knowledge should be widely distributed, not hoarded by elites. Deuteronomy's command to teach everyone everywhere constantly plants the seed that blooms into modern education systems. The separation of powers and prophetic critique establish accountability. Accountability mechanisms. Kings, priests, judges, prophets. Each has distinct role. None controls all. This prevents corruption through concentration. Power divided is power checked. Modern democracies formalize this into branches of government. But the instinct that no single institution should hold absolute power, this comes from Deuteronomy's structure. The prophet standing outside the system, calling it to account. This role persists in free press, independent judiciary, and political opposition. The concept of written constitution derives from covenant documents. Treaties were recorded, preserved, read publicly, binding on future generations. Deuteronomy models this. The law exists independently of any particular ruler. It transcends individuals and circumstances. It creates continuity across time. When Americans revere their Constitution, place it under glass in Washington, cite it in legal arguments, teach it in schools. They practice habits learned ultimately from covenant tradition. Documentary authority creates stability and shared reference point. Deuteronomy also establishes that law must be knowable. Moses delivers commands in plain language. They must be taught to everyone. Justice requires that people understand obligations. Secret law is not law, but tyranny. Modern principles of due process. Right to counsel. Requirement that criminal laws be clearly written. These descend from Deuteronomy's insistence on accessible, comprehensible standards. If people cannot know what is required, they cannot be held accountable for violations. The requirement of multiple witnesses for conviction creates evidentiary standards. One person's accusation is insufficient. Corroboration is required. This prevents false accusations from destroying innocent people. Modern rules of evidence build on this foundation. Limitation of punishment also begins here. 40 lashes maximum. Fathers not punished for children's crimes, nor children for fathers. Proportionality matters. The punishment must fit the offense. These principles, basic to modern justice systems, were revolutionary. In ancient contexts, where collective guilt and unlimited punishment were normal, the book's central theological claim, exclusive worship of one God, created ethical monotheism. The divine is not just most powerful among gods, but the only God, universal and transcendent. This God demands not just sacrifice, but justice. Ritual means nothing without ethics. Worship without care for vulnerable is worthless. This fusion of religion and ethics, worship and justice, This became foundational to Western morality. You cannot separate how you treat people from how you honor God. The command to love God with everything and to love neighbor as self. These flow from the same source. Christianity and Islam both absorbed and transmitted Deuteronomy's vision. Jesus quotes it constantly. Muslims revere Moses and his law. The ethical monotheism Deuteronomy establishes becomes the shared inheritance of three world religions claiming billions of adherents. But Deuteronomy's greatest legacy may be its incompletion. Moses dies outside the land. The law is given but never perfectly followed. The ideal remains perpetually ahead, beckoning but not yet achieved. This gap generates the engine of Western self-critique and reform. Because the vision exceeds any present reality, the present is always inadequate. The law always judges the nation. The covenant always demands more than current practice delivers. This creates permanent dissatisfaction, constant push for improvement, refusal to accept status quo as final. The abolitionists who ended slavery, the suffragists who won women's voting rights, the civil rights leaders who fought segregation, all appealed to ideals that judged present practice. They claim society violated its own stated principles. This form of argument descends from prophetic tradition, grounded in Deuteronomy. The covenant establishes standards that critique even covenant community. The book's structure as treaty creates framework for understanding disaster. When things fall apart, covenant provides explanation. We violated the terms. Consequences followed. But covenant also provides hope. The terms remain. Renewal is possible. Return to right relationship offers path forward. This pattern repeats through Western history. National catastrophes get interpreted through lens of covenant violation. Renewal movements call society back to founding principles. Reform claims to restore original vision. The cycle of judgment and restoration, punishment and hope continues. Deuteronomy also establishes that communities can be held to higher standards than individuals. The nation as collective entity bears covenant responsibility. This allows for corporate accountability. Companies, governments, institutions can be judged by ethical standards, not just their individual members. Modern environmental law, human rights law, international justice tribunals all assume collective entities have obligations and can violate them. This corporate responsibility descends from covenant thinking that bound entire Israel to treaty terms. The emphasis on memory and teaching creates culture that looks backward to move forward. Know where you came from. Remember your ancestors' experiences. Learn from past mistakes. Build on earlier foundations. This historical consciousness shapes Western identity. Nations have founding documents, origin stories, formative experiences. These are taught, commemorated, debated. Identity comes through narrative memory. This habit of thought comes from Deuteronomy's constant command to remember Egypt, teach the Exodus, never forget the covenant. The book's ultimate claim is that law serves life. The commands lead to flourishing. Justice creates prosperity. Ethics is not burden, but pathway to human thriving. Choose life, Moses says, that you and your children may live. This links morality to human welfare, rather than arbitrary divine command. The laws work because they align with how reality operates. Societies organized around justice, limited power, social welfare, and education actually function better than alternatives. This pragmatic defense of ethics descends from Deuteronomy's promise that covenant faithfulness leads to blessing. So, 3,000 years after Moses spoke these words, they still govern, not through religious authority alone, but through ideas so powerful they shape the architecture of Western civilization: written law, constitutional limits, prophetic critique, social welfare, universal education, rule of law, corporate responsibility. These concepts, now taken for granted, had to be invented. Deuteronomy invented them, or at least gave them enduring form, and transmitted them across millennia. The book Moses wrote on the plains of Moab became the foundation text of Western legal and political tradition. The promised land Moses viewed from Nebo remains in a sense unattained. The vision of society organized fully around justice, where power serves the vulnerable, where education sustains identity, where law governs all. This ideal beckons still. Each generation stands again on the mountain, sees the land ahead, and must choose whether to cross over and build it. Moses left the work unfinished, deliberately, necessarily, because covenant is not achievement but process, not arrival but journey, not conclusion but perpetual beginning. The scroll in Moses' hand contained not a completed program, but an ongoing project, the perpetual constitution, the unending reformation, the law that lives by being constantly relearned, reinterpreted, reapplied. This is why the book still governs, not as museum piece, but as living tradition, not as ancient text, but as present challenge. The blessing and curse still sound from their mountains. The choice still stands before each generation. The law still calls from the plains of Moab, inviting another people into covenant relationship, another attempt at the community of justice and mercy and faithfulness. That remains always just across the Jordan,